Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 40 and is a continuation of episode 39, part 2 of the story of the Babushka lady. In today's episode, we finish up the rest of Beverly Oliver's story in her own words, and then I'll have the final word on this far-out and fantastic set of 2 episodes. Or will I? Well, with Beverly Oliver present, you never know who is going to get the last words in. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 40.
There's just so much to tell. I always leave out something. Saturday night, I was, before the assassination, on the 21st, I was with Jack Ruby at the, what? No, the club, at the Cabana, but what's the name of the club? Anyway, the big supper club there. Yeah, the Bon Vivant. Yeah, and then we were there for dancing and drinks, and there were several people there with us. One man's name was Lawrence Meyer, and for some reason Jack Ruby called him Mr. Meyer all night long. There's another guy that I was introduced to as Jack Lawrence, and we stayed for a while. I was dancing with Jack Lawrence most of the time, so I don't know what the conversation was, but we get back to the table, and Jack says, Mr. Lawrence wants steak, so we're going to go out to the Egyptian Lounge, Campisi's Egyptian Lounge, because they did have the best steaks in Dallas back then. They still have pretty good steaks. And so we all went out there, and at one point in time, they got up and went to the office to make a phone call. They said there's calling somebody. Came back in, a few more gracious things were said, and we left, and we went back to the hotel. And it was close to midnight, so I went into the bathroom at the Cabana Hotel, changed my clothes to go to a party in Fort Worth that night. No, it was not at the Cellar. It was another party. It was a private party. And that's what I was doing in Fort Worth. And the next morning, I rode the cab back to Dallas and picked up my stuff and went down to Dooley Plaza. Now, the man who took my film, his name was Regis Kennedy. He was an FBI agent. He was sent to Dallas on the 25th, the morning of the 25th, to be one of the field agents in Dallas investigating the assassination of President Kennedy. Regis Kennedy was also the FBI agent that they sent to New Orleans to investigate Carlos Marcellus, who went back to the government and told him, oh, he's just another tomato salesman. But I believe that Lee Harvey Oswald is exactly what he said he was. He was a patsy. And I do believe with all my heart that Jack Ruby shot him to shut him up.
Can you tell them about the trip that you took with Ruby to New Orleans?
Yes, that was, I'm going to say probably June or July. I don't remember exactly when. Before the assassination, Jack asked me to go to New Orleans with him to the show bar. You'll remember where that is. And he was going to look for some new showgirls, and that's how Jada got down here. He hired Jada that week. And he was looking for an assistant manager for his club. And so wouldn't you expect, if you heard him say this, that he went to New Orleans to hire showgirls and to find an assistant manager for his club? And then about September, this weird-looking guy, I mean, there's no way, unless you see a picture of David Ferry, could anybody ever explain to you what he looked like. But if you saw the JFK movie, Joe Pesci didn't do a good job on the way he looked. Let me tell you, this guy was freaky looking. He had alopecia, so his hair was falling out, not just like here. It was just in chunks over his head. So his hair was all spiky, and back then spike cuts weren't in style. And he had no eyebrows, so he took a coal pencil and drew his eyebrows in a half moon over his face. And he had a little beaky nose. I always said, when they asked me to describe him, I said he looked like a buzzard. And that's what he did. Well, this man starts showing up about September, and he would stand at the door. He would greet people. Back then, I don't know how many of you were from Dallas back then, but Dallas in 1963 was BYOB, which means bring your own bottle. We didn't have liquor by the drink until 2 or 3 years later. And we didn't have microwaves back then, but all the bars had little bar pizzas and those little ovens, little cabinet ovens that you stuck them in, broiled them, took them out, took them to the customers. He'd help himself to the pizzas. He would help himself to Jack's private selection. Now, Jack didn't drink, but he kept stuff there like scotch, mostly scotch. That's why I hated the Kennedys so bad, because I got a portion of his scotch. And this guy would go help himself to the liquor behind the bar like he owned the place. So did I have a right to believe he was an assistant manager? I thought he was.
One last thing I want you to tell him is when you mentioned that Jack hated the Kennedys, but the press has said he loved the Kennedys. That's why he killed Ruby.
He loved Jacqueline. He thought she was a lady of class. But that story about him killing Oswald so that she would not have to come back for a trial, that was a bunch of hogwash. He absolutely said, I hate John Kennedy. I hate his so-and-so Bobby. And he said, and I hate, no, I cannot say the words, he said, their daddy even more than them put together. He didn't say anything about Ted. But those three he hated with a passion. And I joke about it because, even to this day, the Kennedy family gets a portion of every bottle of scotch you buy. They brought scotch to the United States, and they still get a percentage of every bottle of scotch that's sold in the USA.
I won't tell you all about my background, but I did go to school in Rochester, New York. And in the process, spent a lot of time with Kodak scientists and would-be scientists. And what you say about the film, that it could have been experimental.
It was.
And I believe that wholeheartedly, and that gives credibility to what you're saying, that the camera and the film was given you in instructions that it had to be processed by Kodak for it to possibly even exist. My question is that when the film was taken from you along with the camera
wasn't taken.
The camera wasn't, but the
film
was.
It was stolen in 1977.
Did the FBI agent know that was experimental film? Because this is true. Kodak would send film out all the time to people and cameras to try not only new film, but new chemicals that would process that film. And if you took it down the corner drugstore, it could destroy the film very easily. Did they know that this was experimental film?
I didn't tell them that, but it was very obvious that they had never seen it before because it was the first magazine-loaded camera, the square plastic magazine that you did have to still turn it over, but it was in a plastic square magazine. So I'm sure that they knew, and it said on there, you know how it says Kodak and Rochester, New York, and the address on all of their film did back then, and so I'm sure that's where they sent it.
It could have been a cover-up too. They could have messed up and tried to process it themselves and destroyed the film.
Oh, I doubt that.
You doubt it?
I doubt that.
You think this gentleman is credible?
I do.
Okay, good.
Thank
you very much.
I don't know if you noticed or not, but the portion of that I thought was my film and still think it was my film, which Robert Groden, a dear friend of mine who was on the Geraldo show, doesn't think it was my film. But like I said, Nix was standing up at the corner of Main and Houston. I was down at the pergola. That picture was not taken. That film was not taken from up there at Main Street, and there was no way he could have taken the film that he did take that you saw, which was also black and white, make it all the way down there by the time the headshot was done. Couldn't do it. Physically impossible.
I would like to know, of all the people that were out there, and you were out there, how did the FBI know who you were and that you took these pictures? And they knew how to find you, because you said it was it wasn't very long.
It was Monday night, and it's because Roscoe White, who was a Dallas policeman, whose wife worked for Jack Ruby, he knew me. I made eye contact with him, and I knew that he recognized me, and I knew that he would know where to find me if they wanted to question me. I wanted to go find out what had happened to my president. The thing I didn't think through was that the first of the month of November, I gave up my apartment, and I was renting another apartment called Beachview Apartments in Dallas. And my apartment wasn't going to be ready until the 1st of December. So for that month of November the 1st to December the 1st, I had moved out in Garland, Texas with my mom and daddy, and my boss didn't even know where I was staying. So they had to wait till I came to work. and I didn't go to work till Monday night. Now, I want to straighten up about my camera being stolen. My camera, they just took the film out, gave me my camera back. But I gave testimony to the House Select Committee in March of 1977, and I'm not saying this had anything to do with it, but my husband and I are in the ministry now. He's celebrating his 59th year of ordination, May of next year. Or is it 60? 60 years next year. And we were on the road all the time in revivals, like we still do. We drive on a big bus. And we were at his mom and dad's house. I had put a suitcase out in the storage building with a lot of our other stuff. We didn't even have a home for a long time. We call them our porter parsonages. We had buses. We do have a home now. But you remember those round suitcases? I put all my old pictures, that camera, and everything in that round suitcase. We got back home in May, and somebody had broken into that suitcase. We came back home because our little boy died on the road. And I went out there to get that suitcase, and it was gone. And the strange thing is, out of everything, that whole set of Samsonite luggage was there. That was the only one missing. So whether that had anything to do with it, I don't know.
Yes, ma'am. I sure appreciate hearing everything you've had.
Thank you.
Really interested. But one of the critical things I've always wondered about is, since you were there as an eyewitness, could you tell us, to the best of your ability, exactly how many shots you heard?
You know, I couldn't for a long time because I was in such shock. And I did wipe a lot of things. And there's a lot of things that have come back to my memory over the years that I will not share. Because every time I have finished something like a thought and it finally comes together and I ever told anybody, I was accused of changing my story. So what I know is staying with me. But I went under hypnosis. Coke was the witness with the president of the Texas Board of Hypnotists here in Dallas. And did we go 2 sessions, Coke? Was it 2 sessions? 2, and they were recorded because I wasn't taking any chances. I didn't believe in hypnosis, but I was willing to do anything. And under hypnosis, I heard 5 shots that went bang, 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 ba-boom. And a little while later, after we did that, he gave me a copy of the tape. And that is the spookiest thing in the world, because when you're hypnotized, it's not, I did such and such, and I went so-and-so. It's, I'm walking down the street. I'm walking up Commerce. I put the camera in my, it's that day. And at one point, I became so hysterical that he had to pull me up above the crowd and look down on the situation. And what they were really trying to do is see if in my peripheral memory, if there was something there that wasn't in my conscious mind.
That, if you're looking at that, we've seen this stuff for 49 years. My question is, 1, why haven't we seen that before? And then, if you summarize it, you can just look at it and say, there's your answer. But why haven't we seen that photograph on anything, any books, any history channels, or anything?
The only answer that I have is the man Timo Makkonen from Finland was told by Seth Cantor, I finally remembered his name, who's an author that's written some books on the assassination of President Kennedy. He was found down in the ATI building in New York looking at the film, and he was run out. And so he was the one who told Timo Makkonen where the film was, what safe it was in, what canister it's in. Supposedly it's in a big film canister with 6 copies of my film in there. And he told him to go in under the auspices of doing a documentary on how to restore and keep old film footage. And he told him, he said, when you get it out, put it on the roller, which is the thing that they roll it forward to. You get to the headshot and then get as many stills as you can, because when they catch you, they're going to kick you out. And so he was able to get those 4 stills. He came to Ranger, Texas, and scared the mud out of me, and brought that stuff to me. One of the reasons when I talk about being scared, shortly after I was on Geraldo's show and told them I was writing a book, this came in the mail to me. Can you see that? It says death in big black letters. Then a week later, this comes, snitch, you're dead. Both of them mailed from Houston, Texas. At that time, I knew no one in Houston, Texas. I took them to the federal marshal in Lubbock, Texas, and of course they couldn't get anything off them because too many people had handled it. But this is still a very touchy subject.
just over a week ago, I heard Jim Lavelle, who was handcuffed to Oswald, say that for months and weeks he investigated, and he saw no connection whatsoever that Oswald and Ruby knew each other. What is your take on that? I've heard your testimony. Give me your
Well, Jim and I
opinion.
are very good friends, and for a long time, I took him to lunch once a month. I haven't, for the last several months, ever since he had his accident, lost his eye. I haven't been able to do it because my schedule has been so busy. But we talk, and he's a very dear friend of mine, and we get along just fine because it's just like I told him. I said, all you know is what you investigated after the fact and what they told you from upstairs. What I know, I saw with my own eyes. Now, how many of you have ever heard the name Jack Revel? Jack Revel was the head of intelligence in Dallas at the time of the President's Kennedy. My cousin. He just died 3 months ago. So I have very close connections with those people. And that's the only thing I can say is that he just knows what he saw after the fact, and he was probably like the Warren Commission, issued some things that he was supposed to come up with. And because I love Jim, and I don't think he would intentionally lie. I just don't believe that he would, because he's a very honorable man. But, you know, and some people say, well, you can't count on eyewitness testimony. That's what they always say. You can't. All I know is that every big murder case there is, they say, well, we don't have an eyewitness. So I just know what I saw. And I still don't believe that Jim Lavelle would tell a lie intentionally. And I think he really believes what he believes. Now, my cousin, when we were estranged for a long time, and at his sister's funeral, we got back together. His sister, Hallie D, and Hallie D died, and at her funeral, we made amends. And he wanted one of my books. And I said, well, Jack, you know that we're not going to agree on the assassination. And his words to me is, you don't know what I believe, and you might be surprised.
My question was, how many times did you see Lee Harvey Oswald in the club? Just the one, or?
No. No, I saw him. That was the first night that I actually was introduced to him. Then I saw him a couple of times at after-hours parties, and then I was there the night, which I wish I had. I might have to get a copy of that from her. Geraldo Rivera also interviewed Wally Weston. Shoemaker was his real last name, and he was the MC at the Carousel Club. And one night, I walked in, it's the last show, and the stand-up comedian, Wally Weston, was doing his stand-up comedian part. And this Lee Harvey Oswald in the back of the room stood up and he said, I think you're an effing communist, which back in the 60s, that's the worst thing you could call somebody here in America was a communist. And Wally said, what did you say? He said, I think you're an effing communist, except he said the word. And Wally just put his mic down and put his hand down on the floor and hopped off there and went back there, and he was an amateur boxer. And he drew back and cocked him right in the face. And then Jack Ruby came over there and shook him, and he pushed him down the stairs, and he said, I told you, you little SOB, don't you come back in this club anymore. Of course, he was back again, but that was an incident that was actually brought out on national television when Wally gave his testimony. And I happened to be in there that night at the Carousel. How did you? I sang my first song in public when I was 3 years old at the First Assembly of God Church in Garland, Texas. Now, back then, Assembly of God people didn't believe in wearing makeup and watching TV. You couldn't have a TV. They're not like that anymore. And but my babysitter had a TV, and we were very poor growing up. I mean, I didn't have an inside bathroom until I was 12 years old. And there was these beautiful ladies that would sit on the piano with feathers in their hair and these pretty clothes on singing, and they were called saloon singers. Well, one Sunday morning after I got through singing in church, Brother Woods picked me up like this, and he said, and Beverly, what do you want to be when you get grown? I said, a saloon singer. You could hear those people suck air for days. So when I grew up, I was actually 9 years old when I started singing on country western stage shows around Dallas. Y'all remember the Big D Jamboree and the Cowtown Hoedown and those shows? I sang on those starting at the age of 9. And by the time I was 13 years old, I started singing in nightclubs on the weekends. And my mom and dad signed me over to Abe Weinstein when I was 14 years old. Actually 16 years old when they signed the contracts over, because I was so determined to be an entertainer that my daddy felt like, they'd rather know what I was doing, because I'd been sneaking out of the house and riding a bus from Garland, Texas. Y'all remember where the old bus station was? All the way to downtown Dallas, and they thought I was staying with my good friends Mary Noel Peterson, and back then we didn't have phones, so they didn't have any way to check on me. So when they found out what I was doing, they figured out it was better to know what I was doing, so they basically signed me over to Abe Weinstein.
On your first of your presentation, you had 4 quick snapshots about the second slide that you showed when you were younger.
Yeah.
And you ran over them pretty quickly.
Oh, no, you're not going to see that one.
Yeah, well, you ran over one of them pretty quickly. I heard Dixie Mafia in there.
Yes.
Could you elaborate a little on that?
Yeah. In 1966, I married a man named George Albert McGann. And George Albert McGann, according to Captain McCarran of the Dallas Police Station, was the leader of the Dixie Mafia. And the Dixie Mafia was also what they call crossroaders. That was the first beginning of the Mafia that was not really Costa Nostra. They weren't Italian.
Thugs.
Thugs. We were married 4.5 years, and he was assassinated, shot in the back 4 times in the abdomen once, in a gangland slaying in Lubbock, Texas.
So why do you think Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald, and how was he able to get all the way down in that garage up to the guy like that without the police being involved?
Well,
maybe I shouldn't have said that.
You just kind of answered your own question. Right. He shot him to shut him up. I don't know. Don't know if it's the government, if it was the mob. That's the whole thing about this.
I can answer that question. All the policemen were customers at Ruby's Lounge.
Mm-hmm. But they were also customers at the Carousel Club. At the Colony Club and at the Theater Lounge. I mean, they let them in free to watch the strip shows, and they had coffee cups. I don't know if it's coffee in there or not. Oh, I've got to answer this question too. I'm disappointed nobody asked it. Usually, the first question when I speak to kids is, "Were you a stripper?" I tell them, "Well, I'm going to be honest with you. I tried it once." And the men in the crowd started yelling, "Put it back on!" So I knew I better stick to singing.
Ruby used to give the policemen cards, free drinks and free entrance.
But their drinks were always in a coffee cup. Always.
Always.
I want to ask you something later, but one thing I had heard right here.
Where?
One thing I had heard was that people were saying that Jack Ruby had his dog with him when he went up there, and a lot of people have said that he didn't really plan, that was just something that but because they said he wouldn't have had his dog and left his dog in the truck. And
he took his dog with him and left the dog in the car because then he knew somebody would find Sheba and take care of her. Now, the little dancer, little Lynn, that he supposedly was downtown wiring money to, that y'all have all heard for years and years and years, she was dead. She died 2 years ago now. Her son, Michael, called me. We found her in 1990, and then this weird guy found her too and pushed her back underground. But that was all a set-up deal. That was planned long ahead that he would go downtown and wire money to Lynn. Her name is Carlin's, her last name.
I'm going to ask the last question. What is your thinking of when Johnny Rosselli was found cut up in a barrel, and then also the guy who was supposed to testify before the Senate committee the next day and had an airplane ticket to go to Washington, and he was gunned down in his apartment?
Well, that's just part of the assassination. Like, for instance, Roscoe White, who I picked out of a mug book as the person who took my film, really was an FBI agent named named Regis Kennedy. And 6 weeks before he was to go before the House, or the House Select Committee on Assassinations and give testimony about my film, that's what he was being called before the committee for, he died.
And by the way, Dorothy Kilgallen, bless her heart, she was murdered.
Mm-hmm. Yes, she was.
Beverly Oliver, Coke Buchanan, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, and let's keep the torch burning. Don't ever let the flame die.
Whether Beverly Oliver is Babushka Lady is one thing. Actually, one very important thing. And she may very well be the Babushka Lady. Some credible researchers acknowledge the fantastic nature of her claims, but have decided to accept her story anyway of being in Dealey Plaza that day. That group includes Jim Marr, who wrote Crossfire, one of the early and leading books on the assassination and conspiracy. Arguably, Mr. Marr is a hardcore conspiracy theorist, so he is more forgiving on some of the doubtful details that surround Beverly. But nevertheless, she gets a nod from Mr. Marr. One thing is for sure, this is one hell of a story and really fun to listen to. It's just hard to sort out all that's been said by Beverly Oliver and about Beverly Oliver and figure out what it all means to the JFK assassination story. In March 1979, and this was after Beverly had come forth and was now the publicly identified face of Babushka Lady, the Photographic Evidence Panel of the United States House Select Committee on Assassinations, a group you are now familiar with based on previous episodes, indicated that they were unable to locate any film attributed to the Babushka Lady. According to their report, which Robert Groden had a big hand in putting together, he was the famous photo consultant to the committee that had previously worked on the Zapruder film. Well, Groden advised the panel as to pertinent photographic issues and related materials. Committee investigators located many of the suggested films and photographs. However, some items were never located. The most prominent of these known and missing materials included the Babushka Lady film, a color photograph by Norman Similis, and the original negative of the Betzner photograph. Now, we all know that if a government agency had confiscated it and wanted to destroy that evidence, it would have been gone within a nanosecond after the assassination. So the chances of it being available for retrieval, even by a sanctioned investigation carried on by an instrument of Congress, one that has occurred 15 years after the assassination, well, those chances were probably nil. I am not saying that is what happened, because if it did happen, it would have been outrageous. From everything we know about the assassination, it was possible during those times, but not likely in this case to be probable. What adds to the skepticism about her story on this point is that she, at one point, identified Regis Kennedy, a local Dallas FBI agent that was heavily involved in investigating the Kennedy assassination. Well, she identified him as the agent that was there that night at the Colony Club to meet her as she arrived for work, and was one of the two agents who confiscated her film. That was Monday night, November 25th, 1963. Other researchers contend that Regis Kennedy was in New Orleans the night of the 25th, interviewing Dean Andrews. You might know him. He's the shuck and jive attorney that had a moment of fame in the Clay Shaw trial, and he figures into things later in this story. By the way, I can't wait to do that character. My crappy Texas accent is better at portraying a shuck and jive Cajun attorney, or so I think. You'll get to suffer through it soon enough and make the call on that one yourself. The House Select inquiries to the FBI about the existence of the film, inquiries made in 1979, were probably just no more than going through the motions. And it's not surprising that whatever inquiries they made at the time to the FBI about the whereabouts of that film, well, that the answer back from the FBI would be something like, "We don't know. We don't even know what she is talking about." Right? That's probably what they said. Well, I'm just saying. You know, the House Select Committee did a lot of that, by the way, sort of check-the-box stuff. They even went down and sat with Fidel Castro. They did that in a face-to-face interview. Blakey did this. And they actually sat there and asked Castro if he did it. Can you imagine that conversation? It was probably all Castro could do to hold in the chuckle. Really? Ask Castro if he killed Kennedy? I'm sure there was zero chance that he would have said yes, even if he had done it. Well, I guess as a tidy investigator, you have to ask for the record. All right, well, enough of that wander. Gary Mack is a relatively well-respected JFK assassination researcher. Mr. Mack has since passed, and some of the crusade for truth among legitimate research passed with him. He did have his edgy side when it came to the JFK assassination story, and we'll get a chance to hear that in the next episode when we hear about Badgeman, which is another mysterious figure on the grassy knoll that day. Gary Mack played a central role in researching and promoting Badgeman, and he gave birth to the related conspiracy theories that spawned from it. On November 18, 1994, Mr. Mack testified before the Assassination Records Review Board. He stated that, at that time, he had recently been told by an executive in Kodak's Dallas office that a woman in her early 30s with brunette hair brought in film purported to be of the assassination scene while they were processing the Zapruder film. According to Mack, the executive said that the woman explained to federal investigators already at the film processing office that she ran from the main street across the grass to Elm Street, where she stopped and snapped a photo with some people in the foreground of the presidential limousine and the Texas School Book Depository. Mack said that he was told by the Kodak executive that the photo was extremely blurry and virtually useless, and indicated that the woman likely went home without anyone recording her identity. It should be noted that this story involved a still photo, which makes this statement to the records board somewhat quizzical to me, as the Babushka lady appeared to be operating a movie camera in the plaza. But, nevertheless, that is not definitive, and the rest of the facts fit the Babushka description. After suggesting that the woman in the story may have been the Babushka lady, Mack then told the board, "I do not believe that Beverly Oliver is the Babushka lady." Or, let me rephrase that. She certainly could be, but the rest of the story is a fabrication. In fairness to Beverly, Mack was a meticulous researcher, and there were some elements of her story that impressed him and certainly gave credence to the idea that Beverly Oliver was the Babushka lady. He took her to Dealey Plaza, and she picked out the exact place that the Babushka lady was standing as seen in the Zapruder film. There really hadn't been much in the way of photographic evidence available yet at the time for her to be clued in to what that evidence indicated. And the Zapruder film was not yet available publicly at that time as well. Also appearing that same day before the ARRB as Beverly Oliver Masegi, now married and no longer going by her maiden name, went on to tell the Records Review Board pretty much the same story you heard directly from her in these episodes about the confiscation of the film and the theft of the camera. You've already heard her more detailed story on all that in her own words. You know, I like this lady, even though I am pretty certain there is at least some hyperbole in the middle of all of this. And, well, maybe more. But it's just not provable either way. And at times, her pedigree, her background, her involvement at the Colony Club, and her connection with that crowd that hung out with Ruby and others, her legitimate connection with all of that, what she really did see and participate in, well, some of it is definitely true, no doubt about it. And her conviction of delivery makes you want to believe more. But your adult self cautions against it. The trouble is, again, what part of her story is the something else? She was closer to the mob action than most people think. It's worth reiterating one more point on that if you missed it during her discussion. In 1966, when she was about 20 years of age, she married George McGann. McGann was murdered in 1970 under suspicious circumstances that some went so far as to characterize as a gangland-style murder. He was likely a mobster, perhaps even a hitman of sorts, based on his background. He and Beverly ran the Sky King nightclub together in the short time they were married. Oliver maintained that McGann was opposed to her talking about the assassination, and Oliver claimed that at one point he even threatened to kill her if she spoke about it. How credible this claim is, well, you have to believe in her to believe it. But circumstantially, given who he was, it seems plausible. She didn't wait too long after this to remarry. She began to attend church revivals as she pivoted to becoming a fundamentalist Christian, and eventually married a Baptist preacher named Charles Masagi, to whom she was still married when she gave her 2013 interview. A little bit about her personal history that wasn't told by her in her interview. She gave birth to 4 children. A daughter at the age of 17 that was given up for adoption, a son with McGann, the mobster type, a baby that died within hours of his birth, then a 3rd child, a son with Masegi, who passed within 3 months, and then finally her 4th and youngest child, her daughter, Pebbles, who suffers from a genetic disorder. Oliver donated one of her kidneys to save Pebbles' life. There is a sadness about all of this, but giving her kidney to her daughter tells a lot about who she really is. I think it reveals a lot. Some people who have looked at images of the Babushka lady and pictures of Oliver as a young woman, and as slender as she was in those days, have said that the Babushka lady looked too old and weighed too much to be Oliver. Oliver vehemently denies that. Not sure what there is to deny there, but she says it's her. One of the books that she wrote after she appeared in The Men Who Killed Kennedy was co-authored by Coke Buchanan. It was called Nightmare in Dallas, and it was published in 1994. This was but one more of the things that contributed to her continuing notoriety around the time of her statements made to the Assassination Records Review Board. It also contained many facts that serious researchers like to impugn. And the controversy continued over time. At a press conference in 1999, you heard a little bit about that in her own words. Oliver claimed that 4 frames of her film had been located. She showed one to Doug Horn, an assassination researcher, stating that it must be hers because she wasn't in the shot. Horn said that he believed the film to have been taken from farther west than the Babushka lady was seen in other films. She also showed the other 3 images to John Hunt Jr., who was also a JFK assassination researcher, and he recognized them to be stills from the next film. Sorry, Beverly, I have to call this one out. I'm just saying. Over the years, she has been called out on many other specific facts as well. Probably the most notable relates to her reference to the use of a Yashica Super 8 zoom movie camera at the scene in Dealey Plaza on the day of the assassination. Apparently, she maintained that this camera was given to her by her then-boyfriend Larry Ronco. You heard her say that right in her interview. She had met Ronco while working a second job at the Six Flags Over Texas amusement park. Based on Beverly's account, Ronco, who worked for the Eastman Kodak Company, had been hired to film and photograph the Six Flags amusement park for use in advertising, and based on Beverly's account, apparently managed the Kodak presentation at the park as well. When the park found out that Beverly was also working at the Colony Club, well, my understanding is that they fired her. Not fair, but that is how it was back then. Or anyway, so she tells the story that way. It gets more juicy. Ronco apparently proposed to her, despite the fact that he himself was married at the time. Later, after she fled Dallas, after the assassination, she purportedly would file a restraining order against him. Lots of drama here. The Yashica Super 8 camera was not manufactured until 1965. It was not in existence in 1963 at the time of the assassination. Despite maintaining the story in many venues, including her interview that appeared on The Men Who Killed Kennedy, she would later revise it and even denied she had ever said that when she made her statements to the Assassination Records Review Board in 1994. I know, it's just a make and model of the camera. She was 17, and she was not an amateur photographer. What did she know about cameras at that point in life? But it's strange that she would have been so specific about the type of camera and then have this fact-check speed bump appear squarely in the road ahead of her. Now, in fairness to Beverly, you just heard a person that was in the audience address this very issue. A person from the audience who asked a question and made a statement about the camera and the film. A person who actually worked for Kodak in Rochester back in the day. And he validated that it very well might have been an experimental camera, as she has been saying in more recent years. Not sure what his expertise in the area really was, but he sure sounded like he knew what he was talking about. Well, maybe the story might really have legitimacy. So there, far out and fantastic? Yes. And maybe even true. Well, the substantive part of it anyway, that there was a camera and it was experimental. I don't want to be too hard on Beverly Oliver, but as a juror, you have to know all the facts. The reason I like Beverly Oliver is that no matter how much she has contributed to turning the JFK research into an edgy proposition at times, I honestly think she really cares about the country. She cares about the truth. There is no doubt she has used this circumstance as an instrument of some personal advancement. It's not hard to figure that out. Maybe about 30 seconds in, you can figure that out. Probably more for personal notoriety than anything else. Even though she claims she never wanted to be in the spotlight regarding the JFK assassination. And that may very well have been true at first. But let's face it, she was a showgirl, and once a showgirl hits the stage, well, you just have to perform. She's written a few books, like so many people and some of the other celebrity witnesses have. I'm sure she's signed her share of autographs too, etc., etc. So probably there was some economic aggrandizement in it. However, nobody got rich on that score. No matter what, she is part of the vociferous voice that has kept the country on the hunt, marching forward from the 60s for the last 50 years in a way that has helped to keep the spotlight on the topic of solving the case. As far as Beverly goes, there is no doubt her story is far out and fantastic. Choose to believe all of it or only parts of it. Either way, in her own way, I think Beverly Oliver is a bit of a patriot. And that is my story, and I'm sticking to it.
The truth shall set us free. I want to close my presentation tonight, and I'll take questions and answer the questions in just a minute. But each year, almost every year, sometimes I miss like I'm missing this year, I am honored to sing at Dealey Plaza for the memorial service of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And they have a little program down there, and I start the program off by singing the Star Spangled Banner and a couple of patriotic songs. But at 12:30, when the president was shot, no matter who's speaking, I step up to the microphone and I sing what was supposed to be, and I believe it was, President Kennedy's favorite song. And I want to share that with you tonight, just like I do at Dealey Plaza. And I'm going to do it a cappella like I do most of the time. And if you've ever seen The Men Who Killed Kennedy, then you know what I'm going to sing. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I see. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. His grace hath brought me safe thus far. His grace will lead me on. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. Amazing grace,
Thank you for listening to episode 40 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK and The Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 41. I'm sure you've heard of the saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's a good saying, and it applies well to much in life. And it applies to the Kennedy assassination research, too. Beverly Oliver is captivating, and let's face it, a lot more interesting to listen to than me talking about the downward angle of a shot coming from the 6th floor depository. And it gets maybe even a little kookier in this episode today with Badgeman and Gordon Arnold. But don't confuse the entertaining nature of the testimony with your search for the truth. In episodes 39 and 40, Oliver adds to the narrative in a very rich way, but she also muddies the waters more than a tad. I'm not telling you what to believe or not to believe. You have to decide on that. But we are going to review a lot of evidence. We already have. And believe me, there is lots more, and it's going to get progressively murkier as we go. And one bias that we all have as humans, and sometimes it's quite subtle, is that over a long period of relationship with any person or any topic or anything that constitutes something tangible or intangible in our minds, around which to form an opinion, well, it becomes subject to the cumulative emotional biases that build up in our minds in response to how we personally have reacted over time, reacted to each topical stimulus as it occurs, stimulus that can be either positive or negative around the subject. And let's face it, these are biases that can and do sway us. So, simply put, regarding the JFK assassination, we might just become, at some point, say, a conspiracy advocate. In other words, we might have heard enough. We might have passed over the Rubicon, so to speak. Too many coincidences or too many convincing rule-outs. Whatever it was for you personally when listening to all of this. You know, it might have been based on an individual fact or cumulatively based on the impact of all that you have heard. But however you got there is no going back. And when that happens, evidence is then seen in a different light. Evidence contrary to your thesis is minimized or even ignored. And evidence supporting your now preformed conclusion, conspiracy in my example, well, that is what is now emphasized in your mind. And evidence in that case is even mentally repackaged so that the peg can fit into the hole, so to speak, so that the facts can match the circumstance. Look, it happens all the time, and I mean in real life, and regarding justice and the law. In courtrooms all around the country, good men and women are sometimes wrongly convicted, and bad men and women sometimes escape the reach of the law, all based on this subtle but powerful impact that shapes our thinking. Why am I bringing this up right here and now? Well, to me, presumably, that should be obvious and easy to understand if you've been listening along over this long stretch of episodes, and especially after 39 and 40. As a group of jurors, we are trying to stay objective, and you are relying on me to have a reasonable approach to presenting material on this podcast. You have to maintain some level of confidence in that. Otherwise, it just becomes a show. And that was not, and is not, the intention of this podcast. Although I must admit, I do want it to be entertaining too. That is part of holding your attention. So by definition, that aspect is important. For those that have really gotten interested in listening in, I get feedback from you mostly via email or text, and especially from friends in that same category that I have known for years. Many of them are anxious to hear what I really think, who really did it. And maybe it's a good marketing element of the podcast that I keep saying that I'm not going to reveal what I really think until the end. Well, the truth is that I can't reveal it until the end because I don't have a solid opinion on exactly what happened here and who did it. Not yet, anyway. So there, I've said it. Look, in truth, I may never have one. I've been looking at this stuff for 30 years. No doubt, after all that time, I do have a progressively more expansive understanding of it all. All that is not still hidden, I mean. I am confident of that. I am also humble enough about this whole topic to know that I don't know what I don't know about this topic. But I can tell you that when putting together these episodes, I have at times been both an ardent conspiracy theorist and, at times, been quite a skeptic. And in those moments, I have succumbed to the more simple and elegant conclusion that Oswald did it and did it alone. I am, frankly, just not decided yet. And I think that really is a good thing for you as a listener, in terms of what I will present and how I will continue to present it on this podcast. But I still do promise to tell you exactly what I think once and when we get to the very end. You might be surprised at how that turns out. While I was eating a sandwich recently and reading some material on Oswald for a later episode, one thing that came to mind, one thing that continues to strike me is how often and how easy it was for Oswald to lie, and lie plainly and boldly. He didn't just start on the day he was arrested for the murders. His exit from Russia was full of lies to the authorities, and there are other documented circumstances too. Well, maybe the exit from Russia wasn't the best example. Others might lie too if that is what it took to get out of the Soviet Union in that era after getting into such a pickle in the first place. We'll get to that hopefully in another episode. Don't you love that line from me? Okay, before I start to wander, to continue about Oswald here, there is something about that character flaw in him that strikes me. He lied in so many different situations and circumstances and about little things where there was no real gain to lie. Or so it seems. Was it just his nature? Perhaps a trait that came from his own simple history? Perhaps his days of school truancy in New York? Or was it part of his covert nature because he was doing something covert within the government? Or its rogue elements anyway. Or maybe just because he was a sociopath of sorts and a plain old murderer too, seeking his 15 minutes of fame. How sad in so many ways if that was really it. But it could have been. Maybe the Warren Commission really did get that part right. You know, there's a great saying that goes with that one. Even a blind squirrel finds a nut every once in a while. Well, at this point, I'm not going to speculate anymore or reveal any more of what I think personally. I think it's time to get back to the facts. But what we all have to do is to continue to keep an open mind. Listen to all the evidence as objectively as we can, and be ready to throw out some of the evidence because it's just not credible. But as I said at the very outset of this podcast episode, when it's all said and done, we need to do our best to hold on tightly to the baby and keep it in our hands. And then just let the bathwater go its merry way.
About 16 feet north of the southeast corner of that stockade fence, they see some guy, they say, with a uniform on, and he has a badge. And they call him the Badge Man, and they say he's the grassy knoll assassin.
Without further ado, let's listen to episode 41. Badge Man is a name given to an unknown figure that is perhaps visible within the famous Mary Mormon photograph that was taken that day in Dealey Plaza. As we have already discussed on a previous episode, Mary was on the south side of Elm Street facing the grassy knoll, and the picture was taken right at the moment that the president was hit with the fatal shot. The picture reveals in the background a hazy view of the grassy knoll and the area around the picket fence. Perhaps more precise calculations show that the Polaroid picture was taken somewhere between Zapruder frames 315 and 316, or about 2 or 3 frames after Z313, which is the stipulated Zapruder frame number at which the fatal shot was fired. That's about 1/10 of a second afterward. That picture should have solved the case. But like I said, when we first brought the Mormon photograph into the narrative during these episodes, well, it was a Polaroid. If it had only been Phil Willis's 35mm camera, maybe things would be different. But let's not put the cart before the horse here. Because it was a Polaroid, the fact is, it wasn't a very clear picture. Compare it in relative terms to today's 4K picture clarity, and just start working backwards, and go a long way. Honestly, it wasn't even as clear as some battlefield pictures taken in the Civil War. It was a 20th century emerging technology that was an advancement of sorts in convenience, but it was a giant step backwards in picture quality. And because of that, it eventually gave way when better technologies came along. But nevertheless, it's what we got for this exercise. You and I casually staring at the Mormon photograph would probably not see anything in the background. At the knoll, that is. But as you can imagine, others have stared at that photo for thousands of hours and subjected it to an incredible amount of scrutiny and testing. The Mormon photograph, interestingly enough, was not included in the Warren Commission report. One has to speculate that maybe someone at the commission already had contemplated the potential for controversy, although the poor rendering of all the photographs included in the report that resulted from the printing process itself, well, I'm pretty sure no one would have challenged it, and in fact, it may have ironically been better used at that moment for solid evidence that there clearly was no shooter on the knoll, right at the moment the fatal shot occurred. But this is the JFK assassination story, and you can't even make this stuff up. So let me tell you what actually happened. In 1982, Gary Mack, the longtime curator and archivist for the 6th Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza, the former Texas School Book Depository, Mack was the first person to claim discovery of the Badge Man figure. In Mack's visual interpretation, a uniformed police officer can be seen standing behind the stockade fence, with his face obscured by a muzzle flash, but a small, bright object is visible on his chest. The moniker itself, that is the name Badge Man, derives from that bright spot on the chest, which is said to resemble a gleaming badge. Shortly, you'll hear Mr. Mack, in his own words, talk about the moment at which he began to see this in the photograph.
What I was looking at, to a lot of people, might have just been like looking at an ink blot or something. And all of a sudden, I started to see eyes and ears and forehead and hair. And little by little, the pieces of this image started to make sense to me. And that's when I first called Jack. And with his photographic work doing the blow-ups, we could see more and more and more detail. And at one point, we realized that this fellow was probably wearing a police uniform or some type of uniform that was close enough to what the Dallas police were wearing so that he could pass as a police officer. And really, to me, that was the one scary moment, because that was such a brilliant plan. A police officer in that location, away from where people were watching, if anyone did see him, they wouldn't think anything about it, because there were police in that area, although nowhere near where we see this guy. So this guy was an imposter. And I got chills then, because that was the realization that this was a very cleverly, well thought out plan.
You have to keep in mind that the Mary Mormon picture is about this size, and the area that we're dealing with is about a 1/4 inch square. So the area that Badge Man appears in is very tiny. And that's why the attempts to enhance it photographically have been very difficult over the years.
No good deed goes unpunished. Mack, as the curator of the museum, was a well-respected assassination researcher, but this decision to embrace the concept that there was a man in the Mormon picture on the knoll, well, I kind of liken it to the amateur who buys powerful fireworks and sets them off in front of his house on the 4th of July. It's fun, and everyone loves the experience, but you have to be careful not to have one of those rockets end up on your neighbor's roof. It's an unintended consequence that is potentially inevitable from the moment you light the first one. As you might expect, Mack was not the first formal group to look at the photograph and try to find more. If you're like me, the first question I asked was about the House Select Committee's photographic panel and what they thought and did. You see, that took place some 3 years earlier in 1979. And if there was one area that the House Select Committee advanced the ball in, it was certainly in the photographic realm, with Robert Groden and the team looking at much more of the photographic evidence in much different ways, using experts and more recent photographic analysis technology to glean more. Remember, as we learned in a prior episode, the House Select Committee went into their endeavor with high hopes that this arm of the new investigation might blow the case wide open. Unfortunately, as you know, it did not. And in the case of the Mormon photograph, the House Select Committee concluded that there likely was no human figures behind the fence in the photograph. That whatever was there in the picture, well, it was basically a photographic artifact, the definition of which you've heard in a prior episode. But, simply put, it was not a person. But Mack was determined, and he knew what his mind had begun to see and recognize in that picture. Okay, back to why I told the fireworks story. Gary Mack got the ball rolling on Badge Man, but other assassination researchers soon joined in the hunt. And then permutations and combinations of assassination theories began to proliferate around this finding. And then this is where the fireworks hit the neighbor's roof. Speculation about the Badge Man figure helped create conspiracy theories regarding a plot made by members of the Dallas Police Department to kill President Kennedy. And of course, that came with a concomitant claim that they might have simultaneously framed Oswald. The proverbial free-for-all fight in the bar started right up. Metaphorically speaking, of course. It started right up between all the assassination researchers, and for sure, many skeptics went right to work to debunk the idea that someone, anyone, was in that picture, and certainly not a policeman. Remember, there were accounts of men wearing police uniforms that day in the plaza as the crowd rushed up right after the shots were fired. Policemen that perhaps were not in complete uniform, but using a uniform potentially as a disguise. Beverly Oliver just talked about it in the past few episodes, but you don't have to believe her, especially because there are others. And it's not at all far-fetched that such a thing took place, if there was some kind of conspiracy. And then you combine it with the fact that as much as 5 witnesses stated that on that day they encountered a person identifying themselves up and around that area as a Secret Service agent, when we are sure that no Secret Service agents were stationed there. Well, it certainly starts to get interesting. So, were the perpetrators safely among the crowd from the moment the crowd arrived up on the grassy knoll? This is really beginning to feel like a James Bond episode, isn't it? Mack was an honorable man, and as a researcher, he was generally diligent and seeking of details. On this one, he decided to bring in a photographic researcher and someone who was also interested in the assassination, a man named Jack White. White helped in Mack's initial observations related to the photograph. White actually continued to tinker with the picture for quite some time after the initial assessment, all the way into the mid-1980s, I'm told. Eventually, White put forward a new version enhanced in contrast and brightness, which he claimed revealed the policeman figure in higher clarity. These are moments when I wish this was a video program and not a podcast, because the pictures are sometimes worth more than 1,000 words. Like Beverly Oliver's pictures, they are fantastic and, well, maybe too good to be true. But White's rendition of Badgeman sure does look like a police officer staring over that fence. This may very well be what I described in the prologue. How the image morphed into that, well, it's anyone's guess, but the mental properties of closure must have had something to do with it. Is it real, or is it Memorex, as the old saying goes? White's research was juicy enough to be shown and discussed in the 1988 documentary series, The Men Who Killed Kennedy. The series features a close-up of the enhanced Badgeman figure, and that is the photo that is the picture I am talking about, one that is worth more than 1,000 words. The series goes deeply into even more sinister theories about 3 gunmen, including this one identified in the Mormon photo right up on the knoll, that is, behind the stockade fence, and even goes as far as to identify who the shooter was, advancing a theory that it was Lucien Sarti, a French national and alleged contract killer. All right, go get the popcorn, right? Again, I'll let you be the judge on all of that. You'll just have to watch it to have an opinion on it. Certainly don't just listen to me. At the very least, it's good theater, and there may be some truth in there, too. Mack actually worked with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the Jet Propulsion Lab, and the iTech Corporation, and in the end, all 3 of these organizations came to a common conclusion that the photograph was just not good enough. Really, it was not clear enough or sharp enough to definitively answer the question of whether or not the Badgeman figure was really an image of a real person. When this story was used for The Men Who Killed Kennedy, apparently Nigel Turner, who produced the show, engaged with another British photographic expert, Geoffrey Crowley, and his work was represented to have been in support of a figure in the background. Another researcher, Dale Myers, claims to have contacted Crowley and learned that Crowley himself did not support the idea that there was a human figure in that picture. In fact, Myers claims Crowley told him that in 1988, Crowley submitted a 2-page written report to Nigel Turner, basically stating that if it was a human being in the picture, and if they were of average height and build, they would have had to have been standing 12 to 18 feet behind the fence line, and would also have had to have been elevated 3 to 4 feet off the ground in order to be in juxtaposition relative to what was seen in the photograph. And that, at the end of the day, if that was the position of the individual, then it just wasn't feasible to make a headshot from that position. We know just by the way it was described, it was implausible. And in addition to that, the line of sight would not have worked from that point. That is, that far back and away from the fence, the downward angle toward the president's limousine would have prohibited a shot unless they were up that high. Pure geometry. Well, at least some real science beginning to creep into the discussion, as simple and common sense-like as that was. Oh, and they reminded us that Lee Bauer, who was up in the Union Railroad Tower that day, would have seen this, had there been 2 people that far back from the fence. And he did not. Although he did see 2 unrelated individuals, generally in the same area but closer up toward the fence. And he testified to that effect. Crowley also determined that the L-shaped concrete retaining wall would also have blocked Badgeman's line of sight at the moment of the fatal shot, had he been that far back. Meyer would also say that he had applied certain science and techniques himself, and in his own review, he had come up with a similar conclusion as Crowley. In the end, Crowley would simply conclude, as explained by Myers, that Mack and White must have misinterpreted the background and foreground elements that make up the original photograph. Lots of research drama here. But wait, there's more. Can you believe it? If you were the shooter behind the picket fence looking down at the motorcade, then to your right, folks looking at the photograph also saw what might have been another figure. Folks in this case also included Mack and White. Thus starts the story of Gordon Arnold. Now we are talking about a person that would have been physically very close to the shooter. Keep that in mind. Arnold is another of those small coterie of witnesses on the grassy knoll that didn't initially get identified or tell his story at the time of the Warren Commission. But by 1978, his story had gotten out and was more widely known. Let me read to you from a story that was written by Earl Goltz and first appeared in the Dallas Times-Herald on August 27, 1978. The next day, it was picked up on the wires and then made its way across the country and into a few other papers on August 28th. It was one of the first accounts that began to more widely circulate details of this new and intriguing witness, and the idea that he was now potentially identified within the Mormon photo made it even more tantalizing. So here you go. More theater for sure. This is actually the article that appeared in the Victoria Advocate on August 28, 1978, after it had been picked up on the AP wire. It's titled, Secret Service Stories Heard. Let me read the full article to you now because it's got certain other elements that are interesting to you, I think. The Dallas Morning News said in a copyright story Sunday that at least 5 people met men who identified themselves as Secret Service agents in Dealey Plaza just before the assassination of President John Kennedy. The Warren Commission report said none of the 28 Secret Service agents protecting Kennedy was on foot at the scene during that time, and the news said all but one of the encounters were in the parking lot near the old Texas School Book Depository, from which the Warren Commission said Lee Harvey Oswald alone fired on the motorcade. Gordon L. Arnold told the news that he was moving toward a railroad bridge over the nearby Triple Underpass to shoot movies of the motorcade when this guy just walked toward me and said, "I shouldn't be up there." Arnold was a soldier at the time and now works for the Dallas Department of Consumer Affairs. He was not called by the Warren Commission, and he has not been interviewed by the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Arnold said he challenged the man's authority and was shown a badge told by the man that he was a Secret Service agent. Taking up a position on the grassy knoll adjacent to the depository, Arnold said he felt a shot come from behind him. "I'd just gotten out of basic training," Arnold told the newspaper, "and in my mind, live ammunition was being fired. It was being fired over my head, and I hit the dirt." Arnold said that the first 2 shots fired came from behind a fence behind the knoll. During a reenactment for acoustic analysis last week, the Assassination Committee ordered rifle and pistol shots fired from that position as well as from the depository. "You don't really hear the whiz of a bullet," Arnold said. "You hear just like a shock wave. You feel it. You feel something, and then a report comes right behind it." Arnold said he turned his movie film over to a policeman but never reported his story to authorities because I heard after that there were a lot of people making claims about pictures and stuff, and they were dying sort of peculiarly. Others also told the news that they encountered business-suited men around the area who claimed to be Secret Service agents. 2 uniformed Dallas policemen were assigned to guard the railroad bridge, keeping unauthorized persons off the structure. The Warren report, however, said the 2 officers were not assisted by federal agents. "And if there was one Secret Service agent up there, we didn't know it," said Officer James C. White. "He wasn't on that bridge, I know that." But a railroad signal supervisor who aided the officers in identifying railroad personnel on the bridge said he thought a plainclothes detective or FBI agent or something like that was helping the officers guard the bridge. About 9:30 or 10 o'clock a.m., Julius Hardy of Dallas was driving a truck on Commerce Street when he noticed 3 men on the bridge. "I looked over on the railroad bridge and I saw 3 men," Hardy told the news, "and I thought I saw two of them carrying guns, long guns. I glanced to my left to check for traffic and then looked back because even in Texas, it's unusual to see people carrying long guns. Now, I can't tell you whether it was rifles, shotguns, or what, but two of them had long guns. Minutes after Arnold's encounter with the agent on his way to the bridge, Mrs. Jean Hill witnessed the assassination. She was only a few feet from the presidential limousine. She saw a man dashing into the parking lot adjacent to the Texas School Book Depository building before other stunned spectators began to rush up the knoll past Arnold, she said. She ran after the man and was met in the parking lot by a tall and slender man in a business suit who whipped out identification, claiming he was a Secret Service agent, Mrs. Hill said. I thought he was trying to get away, she said, but evidently he wanted me to keep from getting away and pursuing the fleeing man. He identified himself, supposedly, and I took it that he was... I just figured they, the Secret Service, were shooting back. She said she lost sight of the running man as he reached the railroad tracks near the triple underpass. Mrs. Hill, now remarried, said agents from the CIA, FBI, and Secret Service interviewed her in the following year and told her that the man she met in the parking lot with the Secret Service identification did not exist under the name she recalled he gave her. She said a man once showed up at her door claiming to be a Secret Service agent and threatened her to stop talking about the parking lot incident. One Dallas Secret Service agent, Elmer Moore, was in San Francisco at the time of the assassination and did not return to Dallas to join the investigation for a week. Okay. So let's listen to this story as it unfolded and was told by Gordon Arnold himself in the Men Who Killed Kennedy documentary series.
This small area was the scene of an extraordinary encounter. Behind the picket fence, there is a car park, and in 1963, Gordon Arnold was a 22-year-old serviceman, just out of training camp and en route to a posting in Alaska. This is his first film interview.
On that particular morning, what happened was I came downtown and I thought there was going to be a parade. So what I did was I parked my vehicle back here in this parking lot, and I intentionally walked to this particular corner because I wanted to take pictures of the parade off of the railroad bridge. Well, this is about as far as I got, because what happened is when I got my leg to about this position, a man came around the corner off the bridge, had a suit on, and he turned around and he told me that I wasn't going to be there. And I guess I was younger and more spunky at that time because I told him, you and who else is going to keep me off the bridge? And he pulled out an identification card and he said, I'm with the CIA. And I said, well, that's enough muscle. I'll leave. So I turned around and I brought my leg back over like this. I walked down the fence line here about halfway. And I was looking over the fence to see if I could get a good shot of the parade. And he come back up and he told me, he says, I told you to get out of this area. And I said, okay. So I walked the complete length of the fence, got around on the other side. That's when I started to line up my frame so that I could take the picture of the parade. I had been panning shots through here so that I could get whatever was going to come down the street. And I saw that it was the President of the United States. And as I was panning down this direction, just as I got to about this position, a shot come right past my left ear. And that meant it would have had to come from this direction. And that's when I fell down. And to me, it seemed like a second shot was at least fired over my head. There's a bunch of report going on in this particular area at that time. And what happened was that while I was laying on the ground, it seemed like a gentleman came from this particular direction. And I thought it was a police officer because he had a uniform of a police officer. But he didn't wear a hat. And he had dirty hands. But it didn't really matter much at that time because with him crying like he was, and with him shaking when he had the weapon in his hand. I think I'd have gave him almost anything except the camera because that was my mother's. And literally what the man did was kick me and asked me if I was taking a picture. I told him that I was. And when I looked at the weapon, it was about that big around, and I decided I'd let him go ahead and have the film. I gave it to him, and then he went back off in this direction. I went off in this direction. And 3 days later, I was in Alaska. And I didn't come back to the United States for about 18 months.
This story, as fantastic as it sounds, well, Gary Mack and Jack White feel strongly that Gordon Arnold is in the Mary Mormon photograph. And while they don't vouch for all the details of Gordon's story, they place him right there at the moment of the fatal shot. And here is what they said during their discussion of it in The Men Who Killed Kennedy.
We spent a lot of time studying the picture and looking at little details, and I guess in the back of our minds was a story that had come out 4 years earlier by a man named Gordon Arnold, who claimed to be a witness to the assassination and claimed to have been standing up by the fence. And there was a light blob of something very close to where Badgeman was, and we weren't sure what it was, but gradually as details started coming out with Jack's photo work, we realized that this image was probably Gordon Arnold. And here's a guy who had told his story just to an acquaintance and was overheard, and that story went off to the news media, and Gordon Arnold was interviewed, and it appeared in the newspaper that he had been at the scene and was in that location, but no one believed him because there were no photographs or films that showed a man in that position. But all of a sudden, the Mormon picture confirmed his story. And again, the interesting part is that Gordon Arnold's story came out 4 years before we noticed the appearance of this figure in the Mormon photograph.
We later learned that Arnold was wearing this army cap that had a slight point at the top and a medallion on the right-hand side that said U.S. Army, and it's exactly what we see in the photograph. We also know that Gordon Arnold was filming this scene with a movie camera, and that's exactly what the photograph shows, because we see the right arm of the person in this position with his hand up toward his face and what appears to be obstructing his face, something perhaps like a movie camera.
Okay, you are probably already out of popcorn, right? Well, I'm sorry, but in the old days at the movie theater, they didn't stop the film for you to go to the concession stand. Okay, pause the podcast. Now that's progress, isn't it? Okay, back from that wander to the concession stand. Well, if you didn't think two people in the photo was enough, as Gary and Jack continued to stare at that photo, guess what? They saw one more person behind the fence. Another person that was situated behind the fence and in close proximity to the uniformed shooter. Yes, I know. You can't make this stuff up. And remember Lee Bowers? Well, this then conveniently comports with the two people he saw standing along the fence, the two people he saw from his perch in the tower. So here is what Gary and Max said about this third person in the Mary Mormon photograph, what they said in the Two Men Who Killed Kennedy documentary.
I was sitting in my office here one day looking at the picture, and I saw just all of a sudden what appeared to be another image standing directly behind the badge man. This appears to be a person in a hard hat and a white T-shirt. The lighting on him is entirely consistent with the lighting on badge man. In other words, there's a highlight on the construction helmet that he seemed to be wearing. There's a shadow of his head down on his shoulders, and the lighting source is absolutely consistent with the rest of the picture. He appears to be looking off in the direction of the school book depository.
It was important in all this work that we developed somehow some independent corroboration for what we were seeing. And one of the important and yet often neglected witnesses in the Kennedy case is a railroad signalman named Lee Bowers, who was working in a railroad tower behind the picket fence and behind the grassy knoll. And he had a good view of the area where we see these figures. And he testified to the Warren Commission and told them that when Kennedy appeared in Dealey Plaza, there were two men behind the fence that he could see. And these two men were in this one position the whole time before, during, and after the shooting.
Well, After all of that, I really don't know what to say to you. But I do know one thing. When you come back for episode 42, I'll start by making the appropriate comments about the Gordon Arnold story. Until then, well, I'm hungry and it's getting late, so I'm going to go make a sandwich. Thank you for listening to episode 41 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK and The Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. At the end of the last episode, I promised you that during the next episode, I would endeavor to provide at least some objective criticisms of Gordon Arnold's testimony. As you know, I don't usually do that, and frankly, up to this point, most of it has been sworn testimony by mostly credible witnesses. Whatever inconsistencies there are, it's mostly innocent and honest differences in human perception. No real need for me to intervene. But one of our avid listeners, Chris from Wales, the same Chris that helped us identify the issues with Mary Woodford's on-camera statements, you remember them, the ones about the BBC and the men who killed Kennedy? Well, Chris provided more commentary to me this past week after these last couple of episodes with Beverly Oliver. Frankly, the time I spent at the beginning of episode 41 talking about our need to objectively evaluate evidence and in some cases throw out some of the evidence if we found it not to be credible, well, that is a reiteration of something I truly believe to be important. That iteration was inspired by Chris's comments to me, so thank you, Chris. And as a side note, I also cringe a bit when I talk about throwing out evidence that is not credible, because that is just the language that the Warren Commission used when good evidence was ignored because it did not fit the narrative. It underscores in this world that evil hides behind innocent language and the like. It really does hide in the most obvious of spots. So be careful. Like a snake in the woods, you can pass by peacefully, sometimes right next to it, never seeing it, never being frightened by it. But if you happen to step on it, well, all bets are off on what happens next. Perhaps it was timely, and darned if it didn't lead to a real obligation on my part to say something more about Gordon Arnold. I really haven't had a good feeling about this witness from the beginning. It's not that I dislike him, I just have a real pause when it comes to trusting at all what he is saying. As you all know, I turned 60 years old this year, and have met, worked with, been around an awful lot of people in that time. I was in executive roles in business during a good portion of my adult life, and you get a good sense of when folks are telling the truth, when they are exaggerating, and unfortunately, on occasion, when they are telling a Texas-sized lie. Not always, of course. I've been wrong plenty of times, but it's a sense you develop. It's a survival sense in business. Because in large executive roles, you rely on the team, and if there is a weak link, well, it can do real damage. So you always have to continuously assess and reassess regarding whether someone is telling it to you straight. There really is little room for hyperbole, although there is much of it in business. And in most cases, whether it's business or your personal life, there is a downright intolerance for Texas-sized lies. Oh, and then there is this other thing, another sense of things. The longer you live, the more often you come across somebody that seems to match exactly someone else from the past. With this new person striking you as having surprisingly similar traits or qualities, a sort of déjà vu. Sometimes you can put your finger on it, and sometimes it's just a gut feeling. I had that with Gordon Arnold. My brain tells me that he is like someone I have met and dealt with before. Someone who was an exaggerator, but probably not a liar of sorts. He didn't seek the limelight, but he liked to be in it once he was there. A relatively simple soul, I think. It may have been more than one actor from the past that has been recalled from the recesses of my own mind to give me these feelings and this gut sense. What I am using to make this assessment of Arnold, maybe it was a composite of many, but all that really doesn't matter. It's just what's in my mind and how I have viewed this man's statements. All of that has led me to yet another obligatory wander, and so now I will explain. There is no better academic course to take if you want to debunk assassination research than to sit down and read some of the material written by or just listen to Professor John McAdams. For the last 30 or 40 years or so, he has been heavily involved in the subject of the JFK assassination, and eventually becoming the gold standard in taking a contrary view to anything conspiracy-oriented in the JFK matter. John Charles McAdams died this year, just a few months ago. He was 75. Unlike another latecomer to the party, I am referring to prosecuting attorney Vincent Bugliosi, McAdams was more apt to do the hard work around the facts and stick to them as part of his argument. I say that about Bugliosi even though he gets the prize for publishing the book with the most number of pages. And in that vein, all I will say about Bugliosi is that quantity doesn't predict quality, and that is certainly true when reading his book. The tome he published on the assassination, well, it will cause you to change the strength of your prescription on your next set of readers. I say that McAdams would stick to the facts, even if, at times, he would practice exactly what I asked you to be guarded against yourself in the last episode. That property of closure, where facts begin to bend and conform to circumstances which then fit your predetermined conclusions or narrative. So my point there is that I do not agree with much that McAdams said, and I think he dismissed an awful lot of coincidences in the JFK case that make it hard for anyone to rationally believe that they were all just that. But then again, no one really knows. Aside from all of that, he was just plain smart, and having him as a well-respected academic in the fold on the JFK matter, regardless of whether he was a critic or not of a particular aspect of the case, was incredibly helpful for researchers over the years. Helpful in a number of ways. The websites that he maintains or maintained, much to the credit of his successors, they are still up and running. Those websites were constructed and compiled in logical ways and remain principal gateways that are still used today by researchers to access a mound of witness testimony and other elements of evidence in research. All so logically organized electronically on the internet, and it's just easier to use his site than many others. Like Mary Farrell and the Mary Farrell Foundation, his presence in that way has been a genuine help to the research community. I've used the site extensively as part of researching for this podcast. He's also injected, promoted, and inspired matter-of-fact contrary dialogue around conspiracy theories based on the facts of the case as they are documented. Not always strong arguments, but certainly ones based on solid articulation of existing testimony and facts and circumstances. The wander that I guess I've already started on here and will finish now is, as you might have already guessed, it's about McAdams himself. Given that he passed this year and that I am about to draw heavily from him when I pivot to a set of comments about Arnold. It's a wander where I get a chance to take a moment and pay a small tribute to this man, a man who is a celebrity of sorts in this small world of JFK assassination research. Well, it seems appropriate, and particularly because his personal story involves one of the highest profile cases related to academic freedom that the United States academia has experienced in the last 50 years. And no, it had nothing to do with his involvement in the review of the JFK case. In fact, for many years, he taught a college course on the assassination, a course that was popular with the students, as you might expect. So let me take the next 15 minutes or so and complete the wander on McAdams. After that, we'll ride his coattails and give you the anti-conspiracy view of the Gordon Arnold story. So here is the rest of the wander. John Charles McAdams was born in 1945 at the end of World War II, and he was an associate professor of political science at Marquette University. McAdams taught courses on American politics and public policy, voter behavior, and, as I just mentioned, the John F. Kennedy assassination. He had what you might label, at the very least, as a curiously interesting melting pot of first-rate academic experiences. He grew up in the South, attending school first in Kennedy, Alabama, then went on to study at the University of Alabama, right in those heyday years of Bear Bryant as their football coach. And this caught my attention about him because he attended when Joe Namath was there, if you want a famous or infamous time reference. But eventually, McAdams made his way to Harvard for graduate school and then to Columbia Teachers College. Later, he would make his way to Marquette University as a professor. It was here during this time that he became the noted JFK researcher that supported the Warren Commission findings. In later years, he would team up with Max Holland, another Warren Commission advocate, to become what I'll call the bookends, so to speak, in the research community on the side opposing conspiracy. After a very long, successful, and illustrious career there, and finally as a tenured professor, on December 12, 2014, McAdams was placed on indefinite academic leave from Marquette, and he was suspended from all teaching and faculty duties. If that wasn't enough, he was also banned from campus. For various reasons, and because he was tenured, he was able to retain for at least a while his pay and his benefits after being placed on indefinite leave. These events would get much publicity in the world of academics, and perhaps especially because he was a conservative speaking out. The conservative that is rare in academia these days, in sharp contrast to the majority of professors in academia who are liberals when it comes to their social and academic beliefs. And for Adams, this marked the start of a personal 4-year odyssey that he went on, a crusade of sorts, one that finally culminated in an important decision by the Wisconsin Supreme Court that would set precedent and affect the rights of men and women in academia for a long time to come. He did this in his later years. He did it near the end of his life. He did it to retrieve his own dignity and his right to speak out, and frankly, to resist the requirement to be nice about it. And by the way, on that note, he really wasn't nice about it. But as unpleasant as that part of the story is, it's secondary in some sense to the rest of the story. Photos of him taken before all of this happened, and then photos taken of him toward the end, well, like most men and women who become engaged in these sort of epic personal battles, it clearly took its toll. I don't know this, just guessing, but I imagine it shortened his life. In the end, he filed a case against the university, and it went all the way to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And he won. And he was reinstated at the university. And after a 4-year odyssey, it was also after the pseudo-court proceedings he himself held on his own and on his own behalf in the court of public opinion using social media. He did this as he awaited the outcome of the Wisconsin court system. And after the real court victory, he made his way back to campus. Well, at the very least, his online diatribes that weren't so nice, including a campaign against Marquette's administration, certainly must have made the return to campus more than just a little awkward. Near the end, in those last 2 years, I wonder, but I feel fairly certain that despite the price he paid, he probably wouldn't have done it any other way. That was the way he was. And that was perhaps best demonstrated publicly over a long period when he would debate vociferously in public and online at his blog with all the JFK conspiracy theorists lined up on the other side. Well, what exactly was the controversy that caused him the heartburn? I'll discuss it briefly in a moment and try not to lean one way or the other about the topic itself, but suffice it to say that I am bringing it up here because it embodies some of the important concepts surrounding our liberties that we are exercising in this podcast, and it also brings up the basic topic of decency when men and women get into conflicts that involve matters with emotional underpinnings to them. How men and women allow for honest debate on both sides of an issue, regardless of who plays the minority role in the conversation. And we should all remember that regardless of whether you are the minority in the conversation or the majority, whatever the topic, you should be given a voice. But both voices have a place in the discussion at all times. And ironically, for conservatives like McAdams, the tide is turned. For most of his life, he represented the majority. And on this one, the group he identified with represented the minority. This indefinite suspension came about after a very controversial matter occurred, one that involved a microcosm of events that, in some ways, represents the debate we are having in our society today. Okay, now to a brief discussion of the matter that McAdams engaged in. As I have said, McAdams was a known conservative, and an event on campus struck a chord with him and he took up the fight. And he did so by publicly mounting a verbal attack on a graduate student that was teaching a course and was involved in the controversy itself. It wasn't pretty, and McAdams was pretty brutal in the comments made online about this graduate student. McAdams publicly called out a graduate student and instructor by name in a post on his private blog. He said the instructor had refused to allow a student in an ethics class to talk about gay marriage in class. The topic is complicated. Really, it's not all that simple to explain all the facts and events that took place. And there is not enough time in this podcast to address any of it here. Well, to address it and really do it justice to both sides of the story. So I just won't. Sorry about that. But I did take the time myself to read a number of the seminal documents on the matter, including the involved letter sent to him by the university delivering the decision to terminate him. Of the many documents that are available, this is the one that sums it all up nicely without too many complicating details. Amongst all the details, there is one letter from Marquette indicating that the firing was the result of his thrice violating student privacy and deliberately publishing student names and information to target them for harassment. And because he had done so in the third instance, despite previously acknowledging that posting student names was a matter of concern. Obviously, there are more details to the story, but as I said, we are not going to go into them here. In March of 2016, Marquette released an announcement detailing the decision of University President Michael Lovell, formally implementing the unanimous recommendation to suspend McAdams. The university issued a 123-page report composed by the Faculty Hearing Committee after a 4-day investigation. McAdams' suspension was extended until January 2017 without pay, but with benefits, and any return was conditioned on his writing a full letter of apology by April 4th, 2016. McAdams told local news media that the requirement to write an apology was a deal killer. He said very simply, "No, I'm not going to do that." The announcement triggered a barrage of hateful and threatening messages and emails directed at the graduate student and at Marquette University officials. The graduate student later transferred to another university, saying she feared for her safety. Obviously, all of this was a very unfortunate consequence of his own fight over the matter with the university. On April 4th, 2016, McAdams issued a 4-page letter to President Lovell, formally rejecting his demands and calling them compelled speech. McAdams filed a lawsuit against Marquette, alleging that the suspension and pending dismissal amount to a breach of contract. In response, the university does what universities do when these things happen. They released the 123-page Faculty Hearing Committee report, and in it, they alleged a pattern of bullying and reckless behavior by McAdams, including at least 3 previous attempts to intimidate fellow faculty members by threatening to publish their names on his blog. McAdams kept the heat on in the judicial system, and the case eventually made its way all the way to the state's highest court. In July 2018, the Wisconsin Supreme Court ordered the university to reinstate him. Following a sabbatical, McAdams returned to the university in 2019. In less than 3 years after the Wisconsin Supreme Court decision, he would pass away. But not before he declared victory on this last and most momentous personal battle. In his earlier years, McAdams would attend some of the larger JFK assassination forums around the country. First, anonymously, because, ironically, he was certainly a minority in those venues with his lone gunman view. And then later, as a well-respected member of the dissenting community, he was welcomed to come and use his real name and occupation. Perhaps a verbal exchange with one of his conspiracy-supporting antagonists at one of these conferences says it best about John Charles McAdams and what he thought about the JFK assassination. I'll reiterate it here. This, by the way, apparently was a woman that had long been the recipient of his wrath on the JFK message boards that both participated in, and now she had gotten the chance to meet this titan in the flesh at the conference. The exchange goes something like this. She would say to John, "You know, I've been won over by a lot of what I've learned this weekend. Oswald had so many connections to this world." For the listener, I believe she was speaking to the world of the CIA and the FBI and covert operations. McAdams would ask back, "What kind of connections?" "Well," she said, "the CIA was watching him." McAdams would answer crisply and would commence with sage comments. "Careful, careful," he says. "I see it this way. Oswald did some things that created bureaucratic documents. He goes to Moscow and defects. So that creates some documents. The documents end up in the CIA's files. Then he redefects, and that creates some more documents. FBI interviews him. That creates some documents. He has a run-in with anti-Castro Cubans in New Orleans. That creates some documents. But he has a file. There's no doubt about it. But the buffs want people to believe the CIA had agents who were obsessed with Oswald. And that, he said, is bunkum." The young lady would go on to say, "I tried him on a handful of other topics. Each time he laughed me off, and he said his opinion on what had happened at Dealey Plaza had not shifted one bit." McAdams doesn't see any great stakes here. To him, it's all sport. "It's a hobby," he said. "Shouldn't it be fun?" By the time the conference was over, his antagonist would give him a hug, despite the verbal tongue lashings she had previously received online before the in-person introduction at the conference. Now, that interaction is just a nice and perhaps historical memory for one of the army of folks still involved in seeking the truth about the JFK assassination. So now, as we turn to what McAdams had to say about Gordon Arnold, I'll just say this. Thank you, John Charles McAdams, for being your crusty self. Thank you in more ways than one. I don't have to believe you all the time to believe in you. So without further ado, let's listen to episode 42 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Most of the material from this episode was retrieved through the John McAdams JFK website. It's a story written by David Reitz with contributions from other authors. Was Gordon Arnold really in Dealey Plaza? Does any evidence confirm his presence there? Did events occur as he described them? Was he consistent in his recollections? Well, there is good news and bad news for you as a listener today on this podcast. I spent so much time on the prologue for this episode that I'm going to have to shorten up the discussion around the details in order to keep the episode at a still unreasonable length. So this won't quite be a Cliff Notes version, but it will be shorter than we otherwise would present. In my mind, the problems with Arnold's testimony broadly fall into two main categories. The first category relates to inconsistencies in his statements, inconsistencies between the four official versions of his story that he himself told during four unique occasions. The second broad category relates to the photographic evidence itself of pictures taken in the moments right after the shots were fired. Pictures of the grassy knoll area, the area of the knoll where Arnold should have been standing, but is noticeably absent from all of those pictures. Only the claim by Gary Mack and Jack White advocate for the presence of Arnold that day, as you have already heard in the story of the Mary Mormon photograph, including the related story about Badgeman. If it were just one picture or two, maybe one could justify that perhaps Arnold had moved away momentarily from where the camera was pointed, and that's why they didn't capture Arnold. But there are so many pictures taken by different individuals from various vantage points in the plaza, all pointed over to the general area where Arnold was supposedly stationed at that time, so many that the photographic evidence and his absence from it just feels overwhelmingly in favor of confirming that he was not there, at least not where he said he was in the moments right after the assassination. Okay, well, let's start with the inconsistencies in his major storytelling sessions. Arnold had 4 major interviews in his lifetime. The first was a story written by Earl Goltz for the Dallas Times-Herald and published on August 27, 1978. It was the same story that I read to you in a previous episode that was picked up on the wires and published in other cities the next day. It was sort of Arnold's public debut and coming out to the world, so to speak. Then, in 1982, he was again interviewed by JFK assassination researcher and author Henry Hurt. 3 years later, in 1985, Jim Marrs interviewed him as Marrs was preparing his now famous book, Crossfire. And then, finally, a fourth set of interviews occurred in 1988 with Nigel Turner and his team for the documentary The Men Who Killed Kennedy. So let's take a look at some of the inconsistencies between the 4 different renditions of his story that he told. First, let's start with the agent behind the fence. Item number 1. How did the agent identify himself, according to Arnold? In The Men Who Killed Kennedy, the man is alleged to have stated, "I'm with the CIA." But in all previous accounts by Arnold, the man is identified as a Secret Service agent. In The Men Who Killed Kennedy, the man is said to have pulled out an identification card, but Arnold told Earl Goltz and Henry Hurt it had been a badge. These are small details, but they're not the kind of details that you would expect to change from one rendition of the story to the next. Item number 2. In his 1985 interview with Jim Marrs and his 1988 interview for The Men Who Killed Kennedy, but not the 1978 Goltz and 1982 Hurt accounts, Arnold described 2 separate confrontations with plainclothes agents. The first right off the railroad bridge, and the second occurring when the agent followed him through the parking lot and insisted he leave the area behind the stockade fence completely. This brings us to another striking aspect of Arnold's account in The Men Who Killed Kennedy. The Goltz, Hurt, and Marrs accounts are in complete agreement that Arnold encountered 2 separate policemen. One who kicked Arnold and demanded that he get up, but did not brandish a weapon, and another who was crying and waving around a long gun, specified as a shotgun in the Goltz account. For example, Arnold told Earl Goltz in 1978, "The next thing I knew, someone was kicking my butt and telling me to get up," Arnold said. "It was a policeman, and I told him to go jump in the river. And then this other guy, a policeman, comes up with a shotgun, and he was crying, and that thing was waving back and forth. I said, 'You can have everything I've got, just point it someplace else.'" Likewise, Arnold specified to Jim Marrs in 1985 that one of the 2 policemen, demanded his film. This is not the case in The Men Who Killed Kennedy. However, in that rendition, Arnold describes being accosted by a single police officer. Here is what he said in that interview. "And what happened was that while I was laying on the ground, it seemed like a gentleman came from this particular direction, and I thought it was a police officer. But it didn't really matter much at that time because with him crying like he was and with him shaking when he had the weapon in his hand, and literally what the man did was kick me and asked me if I was taking a picture, I told him that I was. And when I looked at the weapon, it was about that big around. And by the way, you can't see that, but on tape, he describes something that's probably about 6 inches in diameter. And I decided that I would let him have the film. I gave it to him, and then he went back off in this direction. Item number 3. A question arises as to who removed the film from his camera. In The Men Who Killed Kennedy, Arnold states that he turned his film over to a man wearing a police uniform, but not, he specifies, the camera itself. I think I'd have given him almost anything except the camera, he said, because that was my mother's. Likewise, Arnold told Earl Goltz in 1978 that he himself took his film from the canister and threw it to the policeman. But in his 1985 account to Jim Mars, Arnold says that the police officer told me to give him my film. So I tossed him my camera, and I said, "You can have everything, just point the gun somewhere else." He opened it, pulled out the film, and then threw the camera back to me. Obviously, those are quite different stories in terms of how the film was removed from the camera. Item number 4. Arnold's interview in The Men Who Killed Kennedy also adds 2 new details to his description of the individuals, or, according to his earlier accounts, the second of 2 individuals who accosted him on the knoll. To Earl Goltz, Arnold had simply described this man as a policeman, but in the Henry Hurt interview, he was a second policeman. But by the time of Arnold's appearance in The Men Who Killed Kennedy, he seems to have developed some doubts about the man's occupation. I thought it was a police officer because he had a uniform of a police officer, but he didn't wear a hat, and he had dirty hands. Let's stop there for a second and analyze that last sentence. He didn't wear a hat, and he had dirty hands. This description appears in none of Arnold's earlier accounts, but it's reminiscent of 2 items of evidence with which he may have become familiar with by the time he was filmed in 1988. I'll get to that in a moment, but if you have been listening along for most of the previous episodes, well, you know what I am about to say already, so here it is. The first piece of evidence around this item consists of statements by Dallas police officer Joe Marshall Smith, who had described to the Warren Commission that he had encountered a man on the grassy knoll immediately after the shooting who displayed the identification of a Secret Service agent. To Earl Goltz in 1978, Smith said, "I remember one thing. He kind of had dirty-looking hands or dirty fingernails, it looked like." He said essentially the same thing in his Warren Commission testimony. But Goltz printed this in the same August 27, 1978, Dallas Morning News article that introduced Gordon Arnold to the world. Note that the man with dirty-looking hands was not a man in a police uniform. However, as in Arnold's story, but a man Smith believed to be a Secret Service agent. Again, that comes directly from his testimony under oath to the commission. Smith's description of this alleged agent also bears scant resemblance to Arnold's Secret Service or CIA agent behind the stockade fence. While Arnold's agent dressed in a light-colored suit and was wearing a sidearm, the man described by Smith in his testimony looked like an auto mechanic. He had on a sports shirt and sports pants, but he had dirty fingernails, it looked like, and hands that looked like an auto mechanic's hands. It's hard to escape the impression that Arnold was simply mixing and matching elements from various stories he had heard or read. And there can be little doubt that Arnold had read Smith's story in 1978. The second piece of evidence that may have influenced Arnold's story is the image that we talked about in episode 41, related to the Mormon photograph. The image of Badge Man by Mack and White, and then the subsequent discovery of a less clearly defined image near Badge Man that they thought could be Gordon Arnold. Shortly thereafter, Mack reports he conducted 3 telephone interviews with Arnold, during one of which Mack says, I told him I had a photograph that may show him, but I didn't want him to see it until I was certain I had obtained the clearest possible version. Arnold's filmed interview for the Men Who Killed Kennedy took place in the summer of 1988, and according to Mack, it truly was the first time that he, that is Arnold, the first time he had seen any version of the Badgeman blow-ups. Let's stop here and think about that. Is it possible that, contrary to what Gary Mack believes, Arnold had seen or heard about the Badgeman image, which, by the way, was published by Mack in 1982, some 6 years prior to Arnold's filmed interview for the Men Who Killed Kennedy? And it was this development that inspired the new description of the police officer as one who was wearing a uniform of a police officer but didn't wear a hat. Another element of Arnold's evolving story suggests this may well have been the case. One more fact to conform to evolving circumstances. When shown a color-tinted version of a Mormon enlargement created by White and Mack, purportedly for the first time, one of Arnold's reactions was to ask someone off camera, presumably director Nigel Turner, would this fella back here, the figure with the hard hat, be the railroad man I asked you about this morning? Because when I was walking the site, I had never told anybody that I had, when we were out there filming, it reminded me that there was a railroad worker just standing out there by the railroad tracks. So, in his interviews for the Men Who Killed Kennedy, Arnold has subtracted one of the two policemen from his earlier accounts, specified for the first time that the man, or one of the men, wearing a police uniform, was bareheaded, and added a railroad worker who plays only a passive role in his story. As you know, this second person, now behind the fence, comports to what Mack and White had begun to say about finding another person in the Mormon picture wearing a hard hat. If these interviews were conducted, as both Nigel Turner and Gary Mack stated, before Gordon Arnold became aware of the hypothesized contents of the Mack, White, Mormon enlargements, it would indeed be remarkable that his 1988 account suddenly fits so perfectly with what Mack and White believed to be shown in Marianne Moorman's photograph. Can we be as certain as Turner and Mack that Arnold's recollections were untainted by any knowledge of what Mack and White had discovered, published, and publicized within the Kennedy assassination research community and done it years before? Let's face it, by the time you get to 1978, some 15 years after the assassination, these kinds of considerations had become standard procedure, so to speak. It was a fact of life that you just had to take the timing of these statements into consideration when evaluating supposedly newfound evidence that these so-called witnesses were proclaiming. Were they in fact influenced by stories and events that became publicly known in the post-assassination era? And, in some cases perhaps, had they even manufactured facts to ensure that they easily dovetailed with other facts that were already given by credible witnesses in sworn testimony, thereby becoming credible themselves? There were other odd things too. It wasn't just those two categories, but we won't go into much of any of that. Well, remember when Arnold said that they could take the film, but he would be so worried about his mother's camera? Well, maybe again, that just seems odd to me. Here's another possibly odd thing. Following his encounter with the two officers, Arnold told Henry Hurt he went straight home. And according to the account he gave Jim Mars, Arnold ran straight back to his car and drove out of the parking lot unchallenged. He identified himself to no police officers or other authorities, and he never mentioned having spoken to any bystanders in Dealey Plaza. This seems somewhat odd to me. Don't you think he would have talked with others in the plaza at that moment? Perhaps had some idea that the president was shot, wanting to know more and commiserate with the rest of the crowd? Wouldn't he have found it crazy that the police or the Secret Service or the CIA or whoever it was took his film? Maybe he would want to talk with someone in authority about that. Look, everyone was in a state of shock, so the normal things people might do, well, that set of neurons might have been suspended that day. I get that. And I cringe when all the logical pundits after the fact want to predict exactly how people should have acted in that situation and didn't. But we are all human. And so I do get the practical side of his story. And if it was true, and if he really thought the police were the bad guys at that moment, well then, you might have a real reluctance to accost one of them and tell the story of your stolen film. I get that too. That part seems plausible and explainable to me, even though the whole of it all is still pretty far out and fantastic. It is worth pointing out as well that Abraham Zapruder filmed the entire assassination from just a few yards away from where Arnold's alleged location was, yet no one tried to seize his film. So if Arnold's film was seized, maybe the bad guys just couldn't get to everyone with a camera. Maybe there just wasn't enough bad guys that day on the scene to take everybody's film, and they had to choose which films to seize from whom. Or maybe no one was seizing film. Anyway, go off in a corner and discuss that one with Beverly Oliver. Okay, all right, I think it's late and I'm getting tired. But we still have to turn now to the second category of discrepancies, the photographic evidence taken in Dealey Plaza by so many people in the moments right after the shooting. Let's start with a recollection by Marilyn Sitzman, Abraham Zapruder's secretary, the woman that we know now from earlier episodes. Remember, Zapruder had vertigo, and as a result, Miss Sitzman ended up standing right behind him on top of the 4-foot-tall pedestal as he was taking his film. She was up there because he had vertigo, so she climbed up as well in order to steady him and relieve his anxiety around that vertigo. Neither Zapruder nor Sitzman ever described anyone resembling Arnold in any of their statements, although Sitzman did recall 2 other people in that area. As she described to investigator Josiah Thompson, there was a colored couple there. I figured they were between 18 and 21, a boy and a girl, sitting on a bench, just almost, parallel with me, on my right side, close to the fence. The bench was located almost precisely where Arnold would later describe himself as having stood. And they were eating their lunch because they had little lunch sacks and they were drinking Coke. The main reason I remember them is after the last shot, I heard a crash of glass, and I looked over there, and the kids had thrown down their Coke bottles, just threw them down, and just started running towards the back. Now, Thompson asked her, to get to this area between the stockade fence and the cement abutment or small mall, did you turn after the shot to look in this general area? Yes, she said. And did you see anyone in this area? No, she replied. Just the 2 colored people running back. When asked many years later by researcher Gus Russo about the possibility that someone had been shooting at the president from the Knoll area, Sitzman replied, "That's absurd. I was only a few feet away, and I didn't hear or see anything suspicious." After the shooting, in fact, Sitzman immediately informed Sheriff's Deputy John Weissman that the shots had come from the book depository, not the Knoll. Mr. and Mrs. Arthur John Chisholm had been watching the motorcade with their 3-year-old child from the north side of Elm Street, near the Stemmons Freeway street sign. They both had the impression that the shots had come from behind them, in the area of the concrete pergola in between the grassy knoll and the Texas School Book Depository. Mrs. Chisholm turned to look behind her, but I couldn't see anything, she said. My wife and I began seeking cover, Mr. Chisholm said. They were captured in photographs that were featured in Life magazine, and seeking cover meant running directly past the corner of the concrete wall, behind which Gordon Arnold would later claim to have had his upsetting confrontation. Neither of the Chisholms ever reported anything unusual occurring there. Cecil Stoughton was an official White House photographer, and he was in the second press car. Stoughton's now famous photograph depicts Tom Craven and Tom Atkins hovering over the Newmans with their cameras pointed right at the family as they lay on the ground seconds after the fatal shots. Behind them, captured in clear, crisp focus by Stoughton's lens, is the concrete wall behind which Gordon Arnold would claim to have had his unsettling encounter. In Stoughton's photograph, there is very obviously no one standing behind the concrete wall or anywhere near it. Granted, that was not simultaneous to the shots, and anyone shooting would not have hung out. But Arnold would likely have still been there, so why is he absent from the picture? There were other photos, too, that were taken of the knoll right after the shots, photos that don't seem to show Arnold or a figure that even looks like him in the photos. The Bond photographs are such a group. Officer Haygood's dash to the underpass. Remember, he was one of the motorcycle policemen that we met in a previous episode. Well, that dash was captured in the background of several photographs, including Wilma Bond's second photograph of the knoll, and another picture snapped by bystander Phil Willis. We are familiar with the Willis photographs, too. Also, clearly visible in both images is the corner of the concrete wall. No one can be seen behind it. At the time of those pictures, approximately 30 seconds had passed since the shots were fired. In the moments that followed, Wilma Bond snapped 3 more exposures that show the corner of the concrete wall. By the last of these, a handful of spectators can be seen beginning to follow Officer Haygood up the knoll. But no sign of Arnold. Several of Wilma Bond's photographs show the first press bus rolling down Elm Street, giving it essentially a timestamp that is right after the shots were fired. On that bus, Fort Worth Star-Telegram photographer Harry Kablik snapped 3 pictures through a window in the bus. His second image captures very clearly the entire length of the concrete wall. No one can be seen behind it. Kablik's photo also captures a man in a suit. That's in the upper left-hand portion of the picture. And that person might be Dallas Morning News photographer Kent Biffle, a passenger in the car behind the press bus. Nobody knew what was happening at that point, Biffle would later recall, but believing the shots came from the knoll area, Biffle headed in that direction. Some teenagers followed, he said. One of them darted ahead and hit the fence before I did. I remember thinking, this nutty kid is going to get his head blown off, and he's not even getting paid for it. He just vaulted over that fence, Biffle said, recalling how he quickly followed suit. He shamed me into doing it. Puffing, I followed him. They never did find an assassin, however, nor did Biffle see anything unusual on the way up the knoll or on the way back. As the shots ended, one of the press cars in the parade was approaching Elm Street and the Texas School Book Depository. We know this car from a previous episode. It contained KRLD cameraman James Underwood, WBAP cameraman James Darnell, and Dallas Morning News photographer Thomas Dillard. And these men jumped from the vehicle and began photographing the events unfolding around them. As the car approached the triple underpass, the 2 remaining passengers, Dallas Times Herald photographer Robert Jackson and WFAA cameraman Malcolm Couch, told the driver to stop, and both ran back to the knoll area. The films of Underwood, Darnell, and Couch all captured lasting images of the knoll, but no corroboration for Gordon Arnold's story. Bystander Jay Skaggs, who had run towards Elm Street after the shooting, snapped a photograph of the knoll from a position close to that of Wilma Bond. By this time, a number of people had begun to walk towards the railroad overpass, but no one can be seen near the corner of the wall. According to Skaggs, approximately 1 minute had passed since the shots were heard. All I can say now is, have you heard enough? Yet, if Gordon Arnold's story is true, no one took notice of a soldier being robbed at gunpoint in broad daylight by 2 police officers, one of whom was crying, and none of the numerous photographers present captured Arnold or his confrontation with the police officers on film. But Gordon Arnold claimed that he was there, and not only was he there, but there were plenty of shots flying overhead. The young soldier felt the first shot, as he would describe the experience, only inches over his left shoulder. So close, he told Henry Hurt in 1982, that when the shots began, I thought they were shooting at me. And as he stated even more dramatically in The Men Who Killed Kennedy, when a bullet goes past your ear and your eardrum feels like it's coming out the other side of your head, it's close. That's why I thought I was shot. Thought he was shot? Oh my. Well, that's enough. I've heard enough and said enough. It's now up to you as a juror to determine what is credible evidence and what is not, what to keep and what to throw out with the bathwater. I'm hungry again. Time for a sandwich. Thank you for listening to episode 42 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK and The Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 43, and it's the first episode in a two-part series, so 43 and 44 should be listened together. The story is about Julia Ann Mercer, a most extraordinary witness story, and that, along with a little bit of a wander and a discussion about our podcast website, well, all of that had to be broken into two episodes with reasonable length. And this one is important in some ways when framing the conspiracy versus lone gunman discussion. You'll see what I mean as we progress. First, good news, listeners. Way back when I first got started with this podcast, I made it a point to set up a website. The website is www.podcastjfk.com. That is podcastjfk.com. I also have an email where you can reach me. It's a Gmail account. It's podcastjfk@gmail.com. Last winter, almost immediately, we ran into some technical problems getting the website set up and running to my satisfaction. Honestly, I had to focus my energies on episode development, so the website went by the wayside, and it's been collecting dust ever since. Remember, I'm an N of 1 in this production shop. Somewhere around episode 17 or 18, I asked a good friend of mine, a former colleague from many years ago, who has an IT background, if he could whip the website into some sort of working order. Well, my friend Dusty did just that. It's a simple and very easy to use site. Nothing fancy here, but perfectly functional and just right for our podcast. Originally, I had planned to place specific supplementary materials for each episode out on the website and also give some additional commentary myself from time to time, along with providing a blog account so that any listener could make comments on each episode and engage in a discussion if other folks wanted to join in. Well, as I said, Dusty did a great job of setting up the infrastructure to do just that. But the simple work of keeping it up and posting information each time we published an episode has been absent. As a result, I really have not promoted the website to you as an audience. Again, this really has just been a function of my own limited bandwidth. There's only so much time in a day, and frankly, I've just been lazy about it. Over the last couple of days, though, I've worked a bit on the website, and I now feel that we're in a position to reintroduce it to you. It's definitely still a work in progress, but now we have taken advantage of what Dusty has set up for us to use. We now have a separate blog entry set up for each of the current inventory of 42 episodes. What that means is that you can go to the website, find the episode that you want to comment on, probably the one that you just listened to, but regardless, there is an individual blog entry for each of the current listing of 42 episodes, and I promise to keep adding a new blog entry going forward for each episode right at the same time that I make the episode itself available to you. You might even want to start writing and blogging, perhaps finding your way into a discussion with someone else on the site if others begin to participate in the blog as well. I hope many of you do. As I said, right now there is a separate blog entry for each one of the episodes and a rudimentary description of that episode as sort of a first entry on each blog. It's basically the same information as I post on the Facebook and LinkedIn posts when I announce the availability of a new episode. There are no supplementary materials for the most part, yet. on the website, except for on a couple of episodes where Dusty and I were purely experimenting on the placement of materials and how easy it would be to do so. And it will be easy, by the way. Again, thanks to Dusty. So, slowly, over some period of time, I hope to go back and keep adding at least some supplemental materials where applicable to each blog entry, if for nothing more than reference and certainly to help listeners who are new to the podcast and want to contemporaneously access the additional content for each episode as they themselves progress through the episodes. Sorry that wasn't there and available for your journey so far, but the next generation of listeners should get a better look. And whatever you can add too as an informed listener will make it just that much more richer as well. For now, the main benefit if you are a current listener is that you have a forum and a format to make additional comments and inquiry and to carry on a conversation with others about a particular topic. JFK assassination forums in general tend to get pretty heated. To be honest, that is the last thing I want to have happen here. I don't expect a lot of people will be using our blogs, but if by chance you decide that you will, then please just be mindful and respectful in whatever you write and say to others. That's really my only rule, courtesy. And I must say that the limited inquiries that I have gotten so far from listeners, well, you have all been superb, very mindful and respectful toward the podcast, toward others, and toward me, of which I am very appreciative, and it's partly why I decided to go ahead and reintroduce the website instead of just shutting it down. So, thank you. Your efforts as listeners have helped to make the ongoing availability of the website possible. The website is mobile-friendly. One more very good thing about it being so simple. You can read and make comments on the run if you like. So if you go to the website using your phone, there is a small black box marked menu in the upper right-hand corner. Click on it. Then, once you've done that and have the drop-down menu showing, well, there are only two choices. So click on the choice that says Episode Summaries with Links and Images. There you can see each individual blog set up in one big continuous scroll. So just scroll down, as they are in episode order, starting with the latest episode. Scroll down until you find the episode that you want to engage with, and then click on it. You can start reading and blogging from there. So again, the website is www.podcastjfk.com. That's podcastjfk.com. And my separate email is podcastjfk@gmail.com. Hope to see you going to the website and hope to hear from you too. Suggestions and comments and questions are always welcome. For those of you still listening, we just hit 30,000 downloads. Originally, I thought we would have a successful podcast if we hit 5,000 downloads. To be transparent, though, this success has been at least partially driven by the fact that we are at 42 episodes and going strong. We never expected to have that many, but still, it's 30,000 episodes and growing. I'm just saying. So I just want to say thank you to all of you. This episode of my own life, this season, that I get to tell the JFK story in my own words, is a labor of love. It's truly a bucket list thing for me. So thanks for going on this cross-country trip. You know, that is the way I described it to you in the first episode, including all the wanders. And we have done just that. And you have stayed with it, stayed with the wander. And we are not to the Golden Gate Bridge yet, but hasn't it been a fun ramble across the inroads of this great country? We may never pass this way again. That is what makes it so special. And you know, we are laying the breadcrumbs on the trail that we are making, so that someday others can take the wander with us. That is the beauty of a podcast. Dot and Dina would be proud of me. You might remember the story I told about those ladies in an earlier episode. They helped to teach me the love of the wander across this great country of ours. I miss you too, ladies. Mom and Dad miss you too. So, let's play the music one more time just the way we used to do it at the Phillips place on a Friday night, and dance all night the way we all used to do that too. And before I get up early in the morning and head west to the Golden Gate.
Dreams, so they say, are for the fools and they let them drift away. Peace, like the silent dove, should be flying, but it's only just begun. Like Columbus in the olden days, we must gather all our courage, sail our ships out on the open sea, cast away our fears, and all the years will come and go, take us up, always up. We may never pass this way again. We may never pass this way again. We may never pass this way.
We're going to start today's story with one more wander because I think it sets up the story of Mercer nicely. You know, one thing I wonder about is how many of you as listeners have been on an actual jury in your lifetime. It's a real experience. I've been called a number of times, but have not served in many, many years. I served on a federal jury once in my earlier years, and it was a trial that was only expected to last about 3 days, and it actually lasted about 30. My employer was thankfully forgiving. I worked at night some to make up for my daytime absence. I won't go into the details about that case, but I'll tell you it's always an awesome responsibility to make a determination in a criminal case, where the prosecutors must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed the crime. It's a serious matter to convict someone of a crime. It affects the rest of their life. It affects people around them. But often, that's the right decision for a jury to come to. And as a juror, you can make a conviction with doubt in your mind. Yep, you can. Just not anything that causes you to believe that the defendant is not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. A minor doubt is okay. In other words, the prosecutors don't have to prove an absolute circumstance, but they do have to address all the matters that result in the jurors eliminating all of their reasonable doubts. So, regardless of whatever actually happened, it's still up to the prosecutors to prove beyond a reasonable doubt to the satisfaction of the jurors that the crime occurred and the defendant committed that crime. That is the system. The burden of proof is on the prosecutors. But the point of that statement is twofold. Number one, there is a pretty high standard to get to beyond a reasonable doubt, the standard for conviction. And number two, as I said, as a juror, you can still have doubts and still vote for a conviction. These concepts are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they are inextricably linked and tied together by the term reasonable. Now, what constitutes reasonable, regardless of all the instruction given to the jury by the judge and in the legal process itself, it's still up to an individual to interpret what that means inside of their own head. That is just the very human thing about it. That's why the jury selection is so important in a criminal trial. And in fact, over the years, the outcome of most famous criminal trials has really been substantially determined, at least in part, by the arduous process that goes on during jury selection and the use of peremptory challenges by both sides to eliminate jurors who they believe might be biased in their opinions on the matter at hand. We have said all this before. You know, most murders don't have an eyewitness or eyewitnesses. That's why the forensics are so important. The experts will tell you that this portion of the evidence doesn't lie. It just is what it is. Certainly, that doesn't preclude the reckless interpretations of that evidence that does occur from time to time. At first, you might say, thank goodness, especially after listening to all of this witness testimony and all the human variation in this case, the JFK case, a case where so many people were in the same place, and they should have all heard essentially the same thing, and in many cases seen the same thing. Literally, there were hundreds of people there, But some people heard 3 shots, some people heard 4, some people heard a shot that was 1 and then a pause and then 2 shots in rapid succession right after. And then some people heard 2 rapid shots first and then a pause and then 1 more shot. Of course, a few other people heard 4 shots, with the last 2 shots being described as so very close together, a circumstance where the 3rd and 4th shots probably occur almost simultaneously. So close together that maybe this is why, in some folks' mind, they morphed into just 1 shot, making it a total of just 3. And then there was the more wild and fantastic with 5 and 6 shots and more, and even coming from people who seemed pretty credible, at least at the beginning. Jean Hill is a good example. But really, it's unfair to single her out. There were others who heard more shots, and some even said they heard more shots that happened to have occurred after the actual fatal headshot. Now, you're just hoping that one of them looks at you and says, "Call me crazy, but that's what I heard." Unfortunately, it's really just left to you to sort out who's crazy and who isn't, because no one is proclaiming that they are crazy as they give their testimony. So what is my point in this wander? I guess the hardest part for me in all of this is the natural human tendency of a few to seek fame in the midst of such a tragedy, to say far out and fantastic things that are likely to be untrue, and as a result, their recklessness and selfish behavior spawns a program of disinformation, one that has been destructive and designed purposefully for personal aggrandizement, yet perfectly aligned and used by any true conspiracy members, if such folks exist, because conspirators couldn't have asked for more of a present from the witness corps. What do I mean by that? Well, I'll explain by example. This latest series of episodes has an element of just that in it, all of these fantastic stories. You then combine them with honest mistakes by some witnesses, or at least the natural variation in eyewitness testimony, and soon enough, all it is a fantastic soup of conflicting evidence. Then, like a little bit of spice thrown in for good measure, change the content of a report or two at the sheriff's office or an FBI report in order to strengthen the lone gunman narrative. Again, I'm not charging anyone with anything here, but it certainly appears that things like that may have happened in a few circumstances. Well, all of that together does what you would naturally assume it would do in any circumstance. It muddies the water. It makes it so murky it destroys just enough credibility of the whole circumstance that suspicion about everything prevails, and a reasonable working definition of reasonable doubt also goes by the wayside. Okay, this is a good point to pivot out of that wander, and let's get to the reason why we have chosen the subject we have chosen for today's episode. I decided to go out of order just a bit and reverse a couple of episodes because as I was having these thoughts that I've been rambling about here, it was very clear to me that one of the witnesses that was on deck and about ready to go, well, she should go first because she's the best example of that mishmash of ideas that I just shared with you. And because we just spent some good time with Professor McAdams, there probably is no one better to help keep our head level-headed about what we are to hear when we listen to this witness that we will meet today, and as we hear the far-out and fantastic tale of Mercer. Let's do just that. So without further ado, let's listen to episode 43. Joe Murphy was a patrolman in the traffic division of the Dallas Police Department, and on the day of the assassination, he was stationed there in Dealey Plaza, on Elm Street, near the Triple Underpass, and he was there to assist in handling traffic. That would be an important function to keep the route for the motorcade clear of anything that might slow it down or otherwise impede the intended progress along the parade route. At approximately 10:30 or somewhere between 10:30 and 10:40 a.m. that morning, Murphy would recall that he witnessed and became acquainted with a pickup truck that had stalled out on Elm Street and that was located between Houston Street and the underpass. As he relayed his official statement on this seemingly routine event, he was unable to recall the name of the company to whom this truck belonged, but he stated in his report that it was the property of the company working on the First National Bank building at Elm and Ackerd Street in Dallas. There were 3 construction men in the truck, and he took one to the bank building to obtain another truck in order to assist in moving the stalled one. The other 2 men remained with the stalled pickup truck along with 2 other officers. Shortly prior to the arrival of the motorcade, the man he had taken to the bank building returned with a second truck, and all 3 of the men left with the 2 trucks, one pushing the other. Murphy noted that the men did not leave the truck except for the one he took to the bank building, and all 3 left together sometime prior to the arrival of the president's motorcade. He described the stalled truck as being a green pickup and noted the truck had the hood raised during the time it was stalled. You know, sort of the way most people might send the message that a vehicle is broken down. This truck had side tool bins on it, and the men had a considerable amount of construction equipment in the back of the truck. Murphy further stated that it was probable that one of these men had taken something from the rear of this truck in an effort to start it. He stated that these persons were under observation all during the period that they were stalled on Elm Street because the officers wanted the truck moved prior to the arrival of the motorcade, and it would have been impossible for any of them to have had anything to do with the assassination of President Kennedy. A Dallas police radio exchange on Police Channel 1 would later confirm the existence of this circumstance, as the officers had initially called for a tow truck. But that request was canceled after the men were able to go back to where they were working and get a second truck that could pull the stalled truck out of the way and out of Dealey Plaza. Now, you might now wonder what precipitated the need for this traffic officer to make that sort of official statement about a seemingly benign event that occurred about an hour or 2 before the president's motorcade was scheduled to arrive in Dealey Plaza. Well, the reason would be Julia Ann Mercer. You see, this young lady, a tender young lady in her early 20s at the time, originally from Chattanooga, Tennessee, was driving through the plaza that day, and she had her own experience with that green pickup truck. One that would stir conspiracy theories and, like it or not, would turn her into a celebrity witness, but not by choice. And this celebrity of sorts that was thrust upon her would result in a deliberate attempt by her to stay out of the limelight of the case for most of these last 60 years. She would get no airtime, as you might expect, in the show that was the Warren Commission. But true to form, well-respected researchers such as Sylvia Mayer would catch wind of her story, and later Jim Garrison would resurrect her as a potential witness for the Clay Shaw trial, and once again thrust the unwanted notoriety upon her. In Garrison's words, Julia Mercer was a highly intelligent individual of obvious good character, the kind of witness whom any lawyer would feel fortunate to be able to call before a jury. Garrison went on to say that her conversion from the status of witness to non-witness, that is, by the authorities and the Warren Commission, is a forceful commentary on the superstate's serene disregard of truth, on its contempt for the mind of the individual. Here is what happened now, and it's a draw from a mix of her so-called official statement on the day of the assassination and later what Garrison would add based on the time he spent with Mercer and as he retold it in his own book, Heritage of Stone. Ms. Mercer was driving westward on Elm Street and had just passed the grassy knoll when a traffic jam occurred, briefly halting all movement. As she pulled to a stop just past the now famous grassy knoll area, but before you get to the triple underpass itself, she noticed on her right a green, unmarked pickup truck parked next to the curbing. To her considerable surprise, she saw a young man dismount from the truck and remove a rifle. The rifle was wrapped in brown paper, but its outlines were quite unmistakable. The young man carried the rifle up the steep incline, which was a westward extension of the grassy knoll, just across the railroad tracks from the knoll. Aware that the president soon was to be passing by this location, Julia Ann Mercer stared at the driver of the truck, who was still at the steering wheel despite the fact that it was now stopped. The driver, whose round face and thinning dark hair would become a familiar one to her, turned and glanced back at her. He stared at her for a long moment, and she saw his features distinctly. One more time before the traffic jam cleared up, their eyes met, and she looked at him full in the face. Then she drove off and let the incident pass from her mind. When the news of the assassination rocked the world, Miss Mercer recalled the incident of the truck and the unloading of the rifle. It rocked her enough to go see the Dallas Sheriff's Department and tell her story to them, right on the day of the assassination. Like all the interviews conducted by the sheriff's office that day, there was an affidavit drawn up. Later, that same affidavit would become a source of controversy as Jim Garrison would declare that some of the information in it was altered and that her signature on it, and essentially the original, was a forgery. A forgery whose later alteration was done in a manner that ensured that it supported what was contained in 2 subsequent FBI reports covering 3 more meetings that were held with Julia Ann Mercer. Meetings that were held on November 23rd, November 25th, and then again on November 28th, 1963. These FBI reports, if you believe Jim Garrison and Mercer and what they said at the time of the Clay Shaw trial, well, those statements would point to a less than forthright reporting by the FBI in those subsequent reports. Now let me explain what happened here and what Garrison would later explain resulted in the FBI's need to have the original affidavit altered in a way that would help the government revise its own FBI reports so that all of them could be consistent with a narrative that was different from what Mercer really had said. What she claims she saw that day is fantastic in the literal sense of the word, and that fantastic story taken down in the sheriff's office report triggered a visit by the FBI the next day on Saturday. Keep in mind that this is 1 day after the assassination and 1 day before Oswald's murder by Ruby. The date and timing of this meeting is critical to the story. FBI agents showed Miss Mercer identification photographs. They lay in front of her perhaps 24 pictures of men. Among them, she recognized the driver of the truck from which the rifle was unloaded just past the knoll. When the photograph was turned over by one of the agents, she saw the man's name, Jack Ruby. She remembered the name afterward. She informed the agents that this was the driver of the truck from which the rifle was taken. When asked if the young man resembled Lee Oswald, whose face was already being hammered into history as the lone assassin, she replied that he did not resemble Oswald in any way. Next, the sun sets on Dallas that night, and then, fast forward to Sunday morning, November 24th, Julia Mercer was watching television with her family when she saw the live television broadcast of Jack Ruby shooting Oswald in the stomach. She yelled to her family that this was the fellow who had been driving the pickup truck which had unloaded the young man with the rifle. Let's pause there and ponder this situation. You see, if the FBI did bring a batch of pictures to the party on Saturday, and Miss Mercer did pick out Ruby from that batch, well, as of Sunday morning, the FBI had a real problem. Lucy would have some real splaining to do here. Well, not Lucille Ball and not Mercer in this case, but them FBI agents. First, for them to have included a picture of Jack Ruby in that array of photographs used for identification on Saturday, the day before he actually shot Oswald, and for it to be related to a discussion of a truck that might have been used to carry a second group of shooters. By definition, a conspiracy then, with him suspected of being in it. Well, just his inclusion in the picture gallery before Sunday's events makes this circumstance into something much more relevant. What did the authorities know or suspect about Jack Ruby at that moment, and why? Why would he have been included in that picture gallery for her to identify? And now, on Saturday, before the shooting of Oswald, they have a credible witness on record stating that he drove a truck, and one of the passengers pulled out a gun case and made their way up the hill to the grassy knoll, and in plain sight of a good number of Dallas police officers. Now, at this point in the story, the mystery starts to appear. The FBI report for that meeting with Miss Mercer, a meeting that was held on Saturday, November 23rd, does indeed document that they met with Miss Mercer on that date and that she substantially recounted the same story. The same story that later appeared to line up so elegantly in the sheriff's office affidavit from the day before. The FBI report states that on the matter most important, she saw a man pull out a gun case from the green pickup truck. Notice that I said gun case and made no mention of a gun wrapped in brown paper. Yet the report for the November 23rd FBI meeting with Mercer, well, it contains no discussion about any photo identification session with her. None at all. Mercer would not understand that this omission had taken place, and perhaps never would have known it were it not for Jim Garrison and the discussions that she had with him as he was preparing for the Clay Shaw trial. She would learn that her original sheriff's affidavit had been altered to reshape critical facts, and then the FBI reports were now missing the photo session which occurred on Saturday, and were surprisingly now very consistent in what they were representing, surprisingly consistent with the copy of her affidavit that was produced by Garrison for her review. One with her signature on it that she would clearly declare was a forgery, as she had not signed the statement that was produced, and in fact, her signature on that document, that is, according to Jim Garrison, didn't even resemble her actual signature. Thank you for listening to episode 43 of JFK, The Enduring Secret.